John Brown, terrorist or freedom fighter. October 16, 1859, a quiet Virginia town explodes in chaos. A white man and 21 followers storm a U.S. federal arsenal. Their goal: spark a nationwide slave revolt, led by a white man willing to die for black freedom. To the south, he was a terrorist. To the north, a martyr. But here's the twist. 18 months later, America was at war with itself. And many now believe this man lit the first match. Was he a madman with a Bible and a broadsword? Or a prophet who saw what America refused to see? Stay to the end, because what he wrote on the day of his execution may change how you see the Civil War forever. This is MetaFacts Legends, where history doesn't just repeat, it explodes. The 1850s in America were a period of profound transformation and escalating tensions, setting the stage for the nation's most devastating conflict, the Civil War. This era witnessed a series of political, economic, and social upheavals that deepened the divide between the North and the South, particularly over the contentious issue of slavery. Understanding this historical context is crucial to comprehending the motivations and actions of figures like John Brown, whose radical opposition to slavery would leave an indelible mark on American history. The North and the South, diverging paths. By the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation divided along economic and ideological lines. The northern states were rapidly industrializing, embracing technological advancements and expanding infrastructure. Cities like New York and Philadelphia became bustling centers of commerce and manufacturing, attracting immigrants from Europe and fostering a culture increasingly aligned with free labor principles. This industrial boom not only bolstered the northern economy but also reinforced a growing sentiment against the institution of slavery, which was viewed as incompatible with the ideals of progress and human dignity. In stark contrast, the southern states remained predominantly agrarian, with economies deeply rooted in agriculture. The cultivation of cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and sugar was heavily dependent on enslaved labor. This reliance on slavery was not merely economic, but had become ingrained in the social and cultural fabric of the South. Southern society was structured around a hierarchy that placed white landowners at the top, with enslaved African Americans subjected to brutal exploitation at the bottom. The Southern way of life was inextricably linked to the perpetuation of slavery, leading to a staunch defense of the institution against any perceived threats. Legislative sparks: the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. As the United States expanded westward, the question of whether new territories would permit slavery became a flashpoint for national conflict. The Compromise of 1850 was an attempt to address these tensions by admitting California as a free state, establishing territorial governments in the rest of the lands acquired from Mexico without restrictions on slavery, and abolishing the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in Washington, D.C. However, one of the most contentious components of the compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act. This law mandated that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even from free states, and imposed severe penalties on those who aided in their escape. The act effectively nationalized the institution of slavery, compelling citizens in free states to participate in its enforcement and igniting a firestorm of resistance and moral outrage across the North. Bleeding Kansas, a prelude to war. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 further inflamed sectional tensions. This legislation repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had prohibited slavery north of the 36 degrees 30 feet parallel, and introduced the concept of popular sovereignty, allowing settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to determine for themselves whether to allow slavery. The act led to a rush of both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers into Kansas, each faction eager to sway the outcome. The resulting period, known as Bleeding Kansas, was marked by violent confrontations, fraudulent elections, and a breakdown of law and order. This turmoil served as a grim precursor to the nationwide conflict that would soon engulf the country. John Brown, from obscurity to infamy, Amidst this backdrop of escalating conflict emerged John Brown, a figure whose life encapsulated the era's turbulence. Born in 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, Brown was raised in a deeply religious family that abhorred slavery. Despite a series of personal and financial setbacks, including failed business ventures and bankruptcy, Brown's commitment to the abolitionist cause never wavered. He actively participated in the Underground Railroad, assisting escaped slaves on their perilous journey to freedom, and established the League of Gileadites, an organization dedicated to protecting fugitive slaves from capture. Brown's fervent opposition to slavery took a militant turn during the Bleeding Kansas Crisis. In 1856, in response to pro-slavery forces sacking the town of Lawrence, Kansas, Brown led a retaliatory raid at Pottawatomie Creek, resulting in the brutal killing of 5 pro-slavery settlers. This act of violence shocked the nation and marked Brown as a polarizing figure, hailed as a hero by some abolitionists and condemned as a murderer by others. The Harpers Ferry raid, catalyst for conflict. Brown's most audacious and consequential action came in 1859 with his raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Intending to incite a massive slave uprising, Brown and a small band of followers seized the armory, hoping to arm enslaved individuals and spark a rebellion that would spread throughout the South. The plan, however, was poorly conceived and lacked the necessary support. Federal troops, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, quickly suppressed the insurrection. Brown was captured, tried for treason, and executed. His raid and subsequent martyrdom intensified the national debate over slavery and propelled the nation closer to civil war. The nation on the brink. The events of the 1850s, culminating in John Brown's raid, exacerbated the divisions between North and South. The North's industrial growth and increasing opposition to slavery clashed with the South's agrarian economy and dependence on enslaved labor. Legislative compromises failed to bridge the widening chasm, and violent confrontations like those in Kansas and at Harpers Ferry underscored the inability of political solutions to resolve the moral and economic conflicts at hand. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, was the final straw for many southern states, leading to their secession and the onset of the Civil War. Conclusion: when the match was struck, the 1850s were a decade of mounting tensions and irreversible fractures. Congress tried compromise, presidents tried to calm the storm, moderates tried to delay the reckoning, but none of it worked, because slavery wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a moral volcano ready to erupt. And every failed law, every rigged election, every lash on a slave's back added pressure. By the end of the decade, America wasn't simply divided. It was primed for ignition. And then, one man struck the match. A failed businessman, a devout father of 20, a bearded fanatic with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. He believed God had chosen him to purge America's sin. He didn't run for office. He didn't beg for votes. He took up arms, not for power, but for freedom. His name, John Brown. Some say he was insane. Others say he was the only one willing to tell the truth, no matter the cost. But one thing's for certain, when America could no longer look away from slavery, it was John Brown who made sure their eyes were wide open. And now, in the next part of this podcast, we follow him from the fields of Kansas to the gallows of Virginia. Because the man they hanged in 1859 would become the ghost that haunted every battlefield of the Civil War. Stay with us. What happens next is not just history, it's prophecy. Everything you're about to hear is built from the most trusted, award-winning historical sources. Midnight Rising by Tony Holwitz, New York Times bestseller. John Brown, Abolitionist by David S. Reynolds, Pulitzer Prize finalist. Original trial records, letters, and eyewitness accounts. Library of Congress archives. And yes, we even found his final handwritten letter, signed just hours before his execution. Your friend, John Brown. God is my judge. This isn't just a story. This is his voice. Part 1.1: The Weight of Failure. before he ever picked up a sword, John Brown had already lost everything. Let me take you back to 1842. A lonely man stands in the freezing wind of Springfield, Massachusetts. His clothes are torn, his boots are worn through. His hands, once calloused from honest labor, now tremble as he clutches a foreclosure notice. That man is John Brown. At 42 years old, he is already bankrupt, not just once, but 4 times. He's lost 2 wives, buried multiple children. He's been jailed for unpaid debts, mocked by former friends. Even his neighbors whisper that John Brown, he's cursed. But here's the twist: this very failure, this pile of ashes he calls a life, would become the firewood for a war that would burn across the nation. The early years, not a hero, not yet. John Brown wasn't born radical. He was born in 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, to a fiercely anti-slavery Calvinist family. His father, Owen Brown, ran a tannery and raised his children to believe that slavery was not only a sin, it was the sin of America. But young John, he wasn't exceptional, not physically, not intellectually. He studied theology, law, surveying, and even sheep breeding, but completed none. He married young, started a family, tried to become a wool merchant, moved constantly, chased contracts, borrowed money, and failed again and again and again. By the time he turned 40, John Brown had tried over a dozen business ventures: land speculation, sheep farming, leather tannery, a warehouse in Hudson, Ohio, real estate in Pennsylvania, a wool partnership in Springfield. Every single one collapsed, a man crushed by his own ambition. What drove him, you ask? A desire to provide for his enormous family. At this point, over a dozen children, but it was more than that. John Brown wasn't just ambitious. He believed he had a divine calling. He once wrote, "I trust God will yet make me an instrument of his great work." Not a businessman, not a husband, but an instrument. Still, by the 1840s, he was crushed under debt. He owed everyone, friends, banks, church members. He moved from town to town, often evading creditors, and began living in barns, literally. And then, in 1843, tragedy struck harder than ever. The year of death. In a single year, 5 of his children died, most from illness, 1 from dysentery, 1 from complications of childbirth. His young son Frederick, age 4, died in his arms. He buried his children with his bare hands. In frozen dirt, he began to speak strangely after that. Neighbors noted how he prayed out loud for hours, asking God why he was silent while children died and slavers prospered. He told his friend Orson Day, "The Lord has made it plain. I must serve in his army, not man's." But it wasn't just personal tragedy that radicalized Brown. It was the wool industry. Wait, what? Let me explain. In 1846, Brown co-founded Perkins & Brown, a wool commission house that promised to revolutionize wool sales for northern farmers. He traveled to Europe, pitched to buyers, hustled across New England. But his plan failed, spectacularly. Why? Because the federal government, specifically the US Army, began buying southern slave-grown wool at cheaper rates. The Army, meant to defend American values, was now propping up slavery through procurement. Brown was livid. To him, this wasn't just capitalism, it was betrayal. They'll feed the mouths of slaveholders before a free man's child. He raged in a letter to a partner, and that's when something snapped. Brown withdrew from the business world entirely. He moved his family to a desolate farm in North Elba, New York, near a black settlement established for freed slaves. There, in isolation, he began to write constantly. Letters, plans, biblical manifestos. He wrote of Moses, Gideon, David, and he began referring to slavery as the Pharaoh of America. He told one of his surviving sons, "I am not a man of peace anymore. I am a hammer. I will strike." This was no longer the voice of a failed merchant. This was the voice of a man possessed by purpose. By the early 1850s, John Brown emerged, quietly, among the growing network of abolitionists. But while most worked through speeches, literature, and legal resistance, Brown stood out. He said, "Talk is cheap, blood is not." He began training his sons in weapons. He formed the League of Gileadites, an armed group to protect escaped slaves. He encouraged black families to fight back with force if pursued by bounty hunters. Even Frederick Douglass, who admired Brown's fire, once said, "He is a man too wild for his time." But Brown believed America didn't have time. He said, "God will not wait forever, and neither will I. Stay with me." You've just met John Brown before the headlines, before Harpers Ferry, before the swords in Kansas. A man who buried his babies and his dreams, and who, in that dark soil, planted the belief that righteous violence was not only justified, it was ordained. But in the next chapter, we'll follow him as he steps out of the shadows and onto the battleground. Stay tuned for part 1.2, Visions in the Wilderness, because what happens next will make you question who the real radicals were. Part 1.2, Visions in the Wilderness. He lost his fortune, then his children, and now he was losing his mind or finding his faith. 1850, the edge of the Adirondack Wilderness. Winter, a log cabin creaks in the icy wind. Inside, a bearded man kneels on the cold wooden floor. His breath is visible in the air. His Bible is open. His hands are calloused, but trembling. He hasn't eaten in a day. He hasn't spoken to another soul in 3. His name is John Brown. And in this desolate frontier, abandoned by creditors, ignored by neighbors, he believes something extraordinary has happened. God has spoken, and what he says is terrifying. North Elba, the silent conversion. After the death of his children and the collapse of his final business, Brown moved his family to North Elba, New York, a settlement supported by abolitionist philanthropist Gerrit Smith, intended as a safe haven for freed black families. It was remote, rugged, wild. Temperatures fell below zero. The land was unforgiving. Brown took it as a sign. If this is where he would rebuild, it would be on hardship, not comfort. God builds his temples in wilderness. He wrote, "And so must I." There were no churches, no neighbors, just snow, scripture, and silence. A mind turned inward. In North Elba, Brown began writing what he called his Testament of Action. He wrote pages of Old Testament quotations, underlined prophecies, compared America to Pharaoh's Egypt, and himself to Moses. But unlike Moses, he didn't plan to plead. He planned to strike. He stopped calling slavery evil. He began calling it America's great blood debt. The blood of the bondman cries out to heaven. He wrote, "And I will not stay my hand." His sons, trained in Bible verse and musket fire, began calling their father the general. But outside their home, few listened, until Brown found a sign, a letter that changed everything. In 1851, Brown read a letter in the Liberator, the famous abolitionist newspaper. It was from Henry Highland Garnet, a formerly enslaved preacher who had become a militant voice for black resistance. The letter said, "We have begged, we have prayed. The only language the slaveholder understands is fear." Brown folded the letter and held it to his chest. He copied it word for word into his testament. And then he wrote beneath it, "We shall speak that language." This was the moment, not a business plan, not a sermon, a declaration of war. The League of Gileadites. Brown returned briefly to Springfield, Massachusetts, and formed the League of Gileadites, a secret armed network dedicated to resisting slave catchers and protecting fugitives. Its motto, "Without shedding of blood, there is no remission." He trained free black men in the use of pistols, taught tactics, escape routes, legal defense. He urged families to arm their children. He wrote, "Let them come, and let them see that we are not sheep, but lions." Most white abolitionists were horrified. Even William Lloyd Garrison called Brown's approach reckless. But Brown had no patience for moderation. This is not a war of words. It is a war of flesh and iron. the first time the US government noticed him. In 1852, Brown's name showed up on a federal report tracking abolitionist unrest. He wasn't just a radical anymore. He was a potential threat. And yet, even as his name darkened in official ledgers, he remained a mystery to most Americans. Until 1855, when he heard about a place called Kansas, the bleeding frontier. Kansas, by then, was a blood-soaked chessboard. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured in, each hoping to sway whether Kansas would be a free or slave state. Brown saw it not as politics, but prophecy. The Lord has opened a new front, he said, and we must go. He packed rifles, sabers, and 5 of his grown sons. They loaded wagons and began a journey west, not as settlers, but as soldiers, the man who dreamed of Armageddon. On the journey to Kansas, Brown claimed to have a dream. He saw a map of America, but soaked in red. He heard drums, not of celebration, but of war, and he saw a black child, free and laughing, standing atop a burning Capitol dome. He told his sons, "I saw what must come, and we shall be first to answer the trumpet." This wasn't just a man with a mission. This was a man with a vision, and the belief that violence was not only justified, but inevitable. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where history doesn't whisper, it roars. In this wilderness, John Brown found his gospel, and in Kansas, he would preach it with a blade. Stay with us for part 1.3, The Man Who Armed the Underground. Because next, John Brown stops praying and starts preparing. Part 1.3, The Man Who Armed the Underground. He didn't start an army. He built a shadow nation. Springfield, Massachusetts, 1856. A knock on a cellar door. Inside, crates of revolvers, kegs of gunpowder, handwritten maps. A group of black men kneeling in silence, being handed pistols by a white man with burning eyes. He's not a general, not a politician, not even a soldier. His name is John Brown. And this isn't a militia. It's the beginning of an underground war. The invisible front line. While the headlines focused on Washington, the speeches, the bills, the endless compromises, a different war was being prepared off the record. John Brown had spent the last year moving quietly between abolitionist hubs in the North. He visited safe houses, churches, newspaper offices. He met with black leaders, escaped slaves, preachers, teachers, and farmers. But he didn't come to talk. He came to ask, will you fight back when they come for you? If the answer was yes, Brown gave them a weapon. If the answer was no, he prayed with them and left behind a dagger anyway. Brown didn't just fund the Underground Railroad, he militarized it. Most people know the Underground Railroad as a secret escape route for enslaved people. What they don't know, John Brown helped build its defense wing. He established fire points on safe houses where fugitives could rest, eat, and if needed, shoot. He created encrypted hand signals for those willing to fight. His sons called them asterisk, stations of the sword. And in multiple counties, he left behind anonymous notes. Do not return. This house is protected. J.B. to Brown. The Underground Railroad wasn't a road. It was a rebellion waiting for a spark. Harpers Ferry, the seed is planted. Long before his infamous raid, Brown was already eyeing Harpers Ferry, not as a target, but as a symbol. It was a federal arsenal, a monument to American weaponry. And he saw it as the Pharaoh's own granary. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, but he also drowned his chariots. Brown wrote. He began sketching early blueprints, studying terrain, river paths, guard rotations. He wasn't acting yet, but he was dreaming, strategically. And then came Kansas, where the guns first spoke. 1856, bleeding Kansas is already in chaos. Pro-slavery militias burn down anti-slavery newspapers. Gunfights erupt in broad daylight. Brown arrives with 5 sons, all armed. He doesn't buy land. He doesn't register. He builds a fort. And then he hunts, not deer, not buffalo. Slave catchers. He leads raids, rescues fugitives, burns pro-slavery camps. At night, he teaches black refugees how to clean and load rifles. One freedman later recalled, he said we had been sheep too long, that it was time to learn the wolf's ways. The government knew and looked away. Despite Brown's actions, no federal troops were sent to Kansas. Why? Because President Franklin Pierce, a Northern Democrat, was afraid of provoking Southern senators. In private letters, Kansas leaders begged for intervention. Washington responded with silence, and John Brown filled that silence with gunfire. His network grows in the shadows. By 1857, John Brown had cultivated a network stretching from New York to Canada, all the way west to Iowa. No central command, no uniforms, just one rule. If they come for your brother, strike first. He sent crates of weapons disguised as farming equipment. Printed coded flyers, freedom tools now available. Contact JB. At least *42 people claimed to have received weapons or training from Brown by the end of 1857. And most of them were black. Brown's most radical idea wasn't violence. It was this: black men should not wait for white saviors. They must fight, lead, and liberate themselves. That idea alone made him more dangerous than 10 revolts. Spiritual warfare, at the heart of it all, was Brown's theology. He believed America had broken covenant with God, and any blood could renew it. He carried a sword, literally, once used in the War of 1812. He called it the covenant blade. Every night, before sleeping, he read aloud, "Cursed be he that holdeth back his sword from blood." He wasn't just training warriors. He was building apostles of holy violence. John Brown tried to recruit Frederick Douglass. Yes, that Frederick Douglass. Brown visited him in 1858 and said, "I have a plan to strike the heart of slavery." Douglass listened, then asked, "What's the cost?" Brown answered, "Maybe my life, hopefully many more." Douglass declined. He admired the courage, but feared the recklessness. Still, he would later write, "John Brown was the only white man I ever met who did not consider me less than his equal." The promise of fire. By the end of 1858, John Brown had stockpiled 200 rifles, trained over 80 volunteers, and drafted what he called the Provisional Constitution, a manifesto for an alternative America, governed by justice, not compromise. He didn't plan to win elections. He planned to carve out a free black republic, in the Appalachian Mountains, supplied by raids, protected by guns, led by former slaves. It was insane. It was beautiful. It was inevitable, because Brown believed this country was born in revolution. Let it be reborn in righteousness. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where true stories are more dangerous than fiction. In the shadows, Brown built an army without borders. In the silence, he found his voice. In the hands of the enslaved, he placed a gun. Coming next, Part 1.4: Blood in the Creek, where that gun finally fires. Part 1.4: Blood in the Creek. He didn't wait for a revolution. He started one, with 5 corpses in the night. Kansas, 1856. The sky is black, the fields are wet, the silence is wrong. 5 men are about to die. Not in battle, not in court, but on their knees, in the woods, their screams swallowed by the night. Their killer, not a soldier, not a bandit, but a man who believes he is doing God's work. A man named John Brown. And what he's about to do will shape the soul of a nation. Prelude to a massacre. Let's rewind 48 hours. Brown and his sons had just received word. The pro-slavery militia had attacked Lawrence, a free state stronghold, burned printing presses, ransacked homes, destroyed the anti-slavery newspaper. To Brown, this wasn't politics anymore. This was the beginning of Pharaoh's plague. The devourer has begun to consume the firstborn. He said, "We must answer in kind." And that's when he gave the order. Tonight, we strike. This wasn't a war, it was theater, religious theater. Brown didn't simply want revenge. He wanted to send a message through blood, through ritual, through fear. He handpicked a squad, 4 of his sons and 2 loyal followers. They dressed in dark coats, wrapped their boots in cloth, and at midnight, they descended on Potawatomi Creek. Their mission: find known pro-slavery settlers, interrogate them, execute them, not with bullets, with swords. Let it be by the blade. Brown said, as in the days of Gideon. The killings, one by one, they knocked on cabin doors. William Sherman, James Doyle, Alan Wilkinson, all had threatened Free State families. All had ties to the border ruffians. They were dragged from their beds, their wives and children watching. One man begged, "I have sons, spare me." Brown answered, "So do I." He handed his sword to his son Owen, who hesitated. Brown snapped, "Do not flinch from justice. Boy, strike as if the Lord himself commands it." What happened next was not clean. The swords weren't sharp enough. Bones cracked, throats gurgled. It took minutes for some to die. But in the end, 5 men lay dead. National shockwave. The news broke days later. Midnight murders on Potawatomi. Fanatic abolitionist slaughters innocents. The South erupted in rage. The North was split. Many condemned the violence, but others, quietly, began to whisper, "Maybe this is what it takes." Even Ralph Waldo Emerson would later say, "John Brown will make the gallows as glorious as the cross." The first political assassin of American history. This wasn't just murder, this was targeted killing of civilians for political reasons. In today's terms, we'd call that terrorism. But to Brown, it was war, and war had no spectators. Let them call me mad. I would rather be mad than be silent. The real target wasn't the victims, it was the future. Brown knew these 5 deaths wouldn't stop slavery. He didn't expect to win anything in Kansas. What he wanted was a legend, a story so terrifying, so morally confronting, that it would split the country open and force everyone to choose a side. Neutrality, he said, is the devil's lie. He didn't hide, didn't run. He wrote letters under his real name, bragged of what he'd done. Signed, "Yours in blood, John Brown." Fallout among abolitionists. Even his allies panicked. William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the Liberator, denounced the massacre. Frederick Douglass called it a tactical mistake, but a moral earthquake. But here's the secret. The Underground Railroad grew faster after the killings. Black families, once afraid to run, now believed someone was out there who would protect them or avenge them. One fugitive later said, "I ran north because John Brown had already run south." You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where history bleeds truth. John Brown walked into the dark that night with a sword and walked out a symbol. Some say he became a monster. Others say he became a message. Coming next, part 1.5, The Fallout. Because after the blood dries, comes the reckoning. Part 1.5, The Fallout. He thought the sword would damn him. Instead, it made him a prophet. Summer 1856. Kansas territory is boiling, not just in heat, but in blood. 5 men are dead, murdered with swords, slain in their beds. And the man responsible, he doesn't flee, he writes letters, signs his name, John Brown. What happens next is not regret. It's not trial. It's something far stranger and far more dangerous. A man kills in the name of God and finds himself followed. Kansas burns. After Potawatomi, Kansas descends into open guerrilla warfare. Pro-slavery militias retaliate. They burn Free State farms. Brown and his sons strike back, ambushing patrols, burning supply lines. He becomes known as Osawatomie Brown, the ghost of the prairies. Never staying still, always armed, always quoting scripture. He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Luke chapter 22 verse 36. Brown believed he was now in the wilderness with Moses. And America, was still Egypt. The government tries to erase him and fails. President Franklin Pierce labels all Free State settlers as rebels. Federal troops are sent, not to stop pro-slavery raids, but to suppress Brown and others like him. But Brown outsmarts them. He splits his men into cell units, moves only at night, communicates with coded Bible verses, burns bridges, disappears into ravines. To the newspapers, he becomes myth. To the South, a terrorist. To the enslaved, a whisper of hope. Brown's killings divide the abolitionist movement. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, abolitionists are horrified. Murder is murder, William Lloyd Garrison writes. We must remain the moral compass, not become the sword. But others, they quietly start mailing Brown money. Wealthy patrons like Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Theodore Parker, men of the cloth, begin calling Brown a necessary fire. They form the Secret Six, a cabal of elite intellectuals and financiers who support Brown without ever publicly admitting it. They buy him guns, maps, horses, a printing press, and eventually a constitution. The Provisional Constitution, yes, a real document. In 1858, in a farmhouse in Chatham, Canada, Brown calls a secret convention. In attendance, 46 delegates, 34 of them black men, all sworn to secrecy. Brown presents a provisional constitution of the United States to govern a new rebel nation he plans to form in the Appalachian Mountains, a safe zone for escaped slaves. We will not beg Washington. He said, we will become what Washington failed to be. He calls it the Subterranean Passway, part underground railroad, part fortress, part rebellion. He was building a state inside a state. This wasn't just a movement. It was an alternate government, with laws, leaders, an army, a treasury, and the goal to make slavery ungovernable from within. Brown wasn't just fighting slavery. He was planning to replace America itself. His enemies multiply, but so do his followers. By 1859, Brown is wanted in 3 territories, has at least 2 bounties on his head, and has evaded more than a dozen federal raids. But the real surprise, his legend is growing fastest in the black press. Editorials begin referring to him as the White Moses, our sword from the north, a friend whose hands are red for us. One formerly enslaved woman wrote, I had never seen him, but I knew I would follow him, even into hell. Personal cost, but not all is glory. In 1856, Brown's son Frederick is killed in a skirmish near Osawatomie, shot in the back by a pro-slavery militiaman. When Brown finds the body, he says nothing. He kneels, covers his son's eyes, then rides into the night. He later tells his daughter, I have lost a child, but I have not lost the war. Frederick Douglass tries to stop him. Brown meets again with Frederick Douglass, this time in secret. Brown tells him, the time has come. I will strike at the arsenal. Harpers Ferry. Douglass begs him to reconsider. You will fail. John, you will die. Brown smiles. Then I will be remembered. He hands Douglass a letter, sealed. If I fall, read it aloud. Let the nation hear what it dared to ignore. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where rebels become rulers, and fire becomes scripture. In Kansas, Brown became a killer. In exile, he became a founder. And now, he prepares to become a martyr. Next episode, Part 1.6, A Holy Army of 21. He will choose them, train them, and lead them into the gates of Harpers Ferry. Part 1.6, A Holy Army of 21. He didn't recruit soldiers. He chose believers. A barn in Maryland. No flag, no drum, just 21 men, seated in a circle, heads bowed. Before them stands a bearded man holding a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. His voice is low, calm, but every word is a thunderclap. We are the first, and if we fall, others will rise, because truth cannot be hung, and freedom cannot be buried. His name is John Brown, and these 21 souls are ready to follow him into fire. The planning begins. Brown has moved to a small farmhouse near Harpers Ferry, Virginia, under the alias Isaac Smith. The location is no accident. Harpers Ferry holds a federal arsenal full of weapons, a major railway junction perfect for a skateboard destruction, and lies in the Shenandoah Valley, surrounded by enslaved populations. To Brown, it's the perfect ignition point for a nationwide slave revolt. He doesn't plan a protest. He plans an explosion, but he knows he can't do it alone. Brown doesn't seek fighters, he seeks disciples. His recruitment is strange. He doesn't ask about military experience. He doesn't offer pay. Instead, he asks, are you ready to die without killing? Are you ready to kill without hatred? Are you ready to fail and still believe? Most men say no, but 21 say yes. WHO were the 21. They were not elite, they were not trained. They were farmers, students, blacksmiths, shoemakers, 2 formerly enslaved men, several of Brown's own sons. Youngest, Oliver Brown, 21. Oldest, John Cook, 29. Most never fired a shot in war, but they believed, and in Brown's eyes, belief was better than bullets. The oath. On October 7, 1859, Brown gathers his men. He reads from Isaiah chapter 61. The Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. Then he passes around a simple document, the oath of the Provisional Army of the United States. Each man signs, each knows what it means. No surrender, no retreat, no mercy for tyrants, no violence against innocents. It's not a militia, it's a crusade. Stockpiling in secret. For weeks, Brown and his men secretly amass weapons. 200 Sharps rifles, 950 pikes, 1.00 rounds of ammunition. Why pikes? Because he plans to arm freed slaves, many of whom have never held a gun. He says, the blade does not jam. The blade does not misfire. The blade tells no lies. The plan is to seize Harpers Ferry, hold it, rally enslaved people from nearby plantations, retreat into the mountains, and build a black republic of freedom. Insane, yes, but also brilliant in its symbolism. The men begin to doubt, but Brown doubles down. As the day nears, whispers grow louder. What if no one rises? What if we're surrounded? What if we die for nothing? Brown's answer is chilling. Then we will die rightly, and the ground we fall upon will remember. He begins holding daily prayers, reads from Revelation, sleeps little, smiles often. One follower, John Cargy, writes, he believes he is a prophet, and I am starting to believe it, too. The final straw. On October 14th, Brown receives a letter. It's unsigned, likely from a friend. Turn back, you will be butchered. Nothing good will come of this. Brown reads it aloud to the group, then burns it. This is not a campaign. It is a covenant, and no covenant begins with safety. The final prayer, October 16th, 1859, evening. Brown gathers the 21. He places a hand on each of their heads. May the Lord bless you. May he be your shield and your sword. Then he reads his final note to them. If we fail tonight, let our names be curses to tyrants and songs to the oppressed. They move silently, cross the river, enter the town, and history holds its breath. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where truth isn't whispered, it's shouted in blood and fire. In the hills of Virginia, 21 men made a choice, to live free or to die unforgotten. Next episode, Part 1.7, March to Harpers Ferry. The raid begins, but nothing and no one goes as planned. Part 1.7, March to Harpers Ferry. He believed when the gates opened, 1,000 slaves would rise. But when he knocked, no one answered. October 16th, 1859. The wind is cold, the river black. 21 men cross a wooden bridge in silence. No flags, no uniforms, no war cries, only steel and faith. Ahead lies Harpers Ferry, Virginia, home to the U.S. Federal Armory. Behind them, nothing. If they fail, there is no retreat, no pardon, only the roop. And yet, John Brown walks forward with peace in his eyes. We have no time, he whispers. The world will be changed tonight. The plan. John Brown's plan was, on paper, simple, even elegant. Seize the armory at Harpers Ferry, a storehouse of over 100.00 weapons. Capture key bridges to block reinforcements. Send word to nearby plantations to inspire a mass slave uprising. Arm the freedmen. Retreat to the Appalachians, where they would form a mobile insurgent base, a mountain republic for black freedom. He called it the beginning of the end of slavery. He believed hundreds, even thousands, would rise to join them. But no plan survives the night. The town that slept through revolution. At 10:30 p.m., Brown's men begin their operation. They cut the telegraph wires, capture the watchmen, secure the bridges, enter the armory grounds, all without a single shot. By midnight, they control Harpers Ferry, and yet, it's silent. No slaves arrive, no rebellion begins, no distant drums of freedom. Just wind. Brown waits, and waits. They will come, he says. God does not lie, but God, it seems, is late. The first blood, and the first mistake. Around 1:30 a.m., a freight train approaches. Brown's men stop it. One of the conductors, Hayward Shepard, a free black man, panics and runs. Brown orders no violence, but a gunshot rings out. Shepard is hit. He dies hours later. The first man killed by Brown's army is black. The irony is devastating, and the plan already spiraling. The delay. Brown had promised his men in and out by dawn, but he hesitates. He keeps the hostages, including Colonel Lewis Washington, great-grandnephew of George Washington, alive. He believes they'll be useful later. I need time, he mutters. The people will rise, but as the sun rises, so do the townsfolk, with guns. Brown didn't plan for silence. By 6 a.m., no enslaved people have joined. The plantations remain quiet. The call to freedom goes unanswered. Why? Because many enslaved people thought it was a trap. Because rumors had spread that slaveholders staged fake uprisings to catch escapees. Brown's flaw wasn't strategy. It was faith in a nation too traumatized to believe in hope. The shooting begins. Local militia surrounds the armory. Brown's men dig in. Gunfire erupts from buildings. Civilians join the siege. By noon, 4 of Brown's men are dead. 2 of his sons are wounded. Brown refuses to retreat. We hold until the voice of the oppressed answers us, he declares, but that voice never comes. Brown doesn't retreat because he's waiting for history. At this point, Brown could flee, but he doesn't, not because he's trapped, but because he's choosing to stand. Why? Because he believes that a glorious defeat will echo longer than a quiet escape. Let it be written, he says, that free men once stood their ground in the devil's house. He no longer thinks like a general. He thinks like a martyr. Enter the U.S. Marines. October 18th, dawn. The U.S. government finally acts. President Buchanan sends in the Marines. Leading them, a then unknown colonel named Robert E. Lee. With him, J.E.B. Stuart, who will later become a Confederate legend. Together, they prepare to storm the engine house, where Brown and his remaining men are holed up. They give him one chance to surrender. He refuses. I prefer to die here, for this is holy ground now. The final assault, a battering ram crushes the door. Gunfire, smoke, screams. Brown is struck in the head and stabbed. 10 of his men are killed, including his son Oliver, who dies in front of him, gasping. This is not the end. Brown whispers. He is captured, bloodied, barely conscious, but alive, and the legend is just beginning. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where men don't just fight history, they ignite it. John Brown believed he was starting a war. He didn't realize he had already started one. Coming next, Part 1.8 Failure by Design. Because some defeats are too perfect to be accidents. Part 1.8 Failure by Design. He lost the battle, but what if he never meant to win? October 18th, 1859. The siege is over, the blood is dry, the guns are silent. John Brown lies on the cold stone floor of the engine house. His son is dead, his men are gone. He is captured, concussed, and bleeding. But when a soldier leans down and whispers, "You've failed," Brown doesn't blink. He says, "I have not failed, I have planted, and the seed is growing." The trial. Just days later, Brown stands trial in Charlestown, Virginia. He is charged with treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, murder, inciting a slave insurrection. But the courtroom soon realizes this is no ordinary defendant. Brown refuses to deny the facts. He admits to everything, but defends nothing. Instead, he speaks like a prophet. "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of justice, I submit. I believe that to have interfered was not wrong, but right." His words are published across the country. In the North, reprinted as sermons. In the South, read aloud in outrage. And in every reading, his voice gets louder. The speech that split America. At sentencing, Brown is allowed a final statement. He says, "I believe that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." In under 30 seconds, he condemns the entire nation, predicts a coming civil war, forgives his captors, accepts his death, and the kicker, he asks for no mercy. Even his enemies are stunned. The judge weeps. The legend ignites. Over the next 6 weeks, Brown writes dozens of letters from his jail cell. He responds to supporters, critics, journalists, ministers. He becomes a media icon, the first viral revolutionary. Northern schoolchildren sing songs about him. Southern governors demand faster execution. He tells a visitor, "I am worth infinitely more to die than to live." Brown isn't awaiting execution. He's staging a martyrdom. The letter to his wife and to history. To his wife Mary, he writes, "Do not grieve me, dear. I am quite cheerful, composed, and happy. I feel no consciousness of guilt." He includes a poem, hand-copied. "I am going to that country where no slave driver lashes the back, where all equal, free, and know no chains." He signs it, "Your loving husband, until we meet where there are no more tears." John. The South thinks it's over, but it's just beginning. December 2nd, 1859. John Brown is hanged in front of a crowd of thousands. He walks calmly, kisses a black child on the way to the gallows, refuses a blindfold. When the trapdoor opens, a reporter writes, "The crowd gasped, but John Brown never flinched." Brown's death is staged like a religious ritual. His followers collect his blood-soaked clothing, his hair, his final notes. They treat them as relics. One newspaper calls him the Christ of Abolition, another, a madman who now haunts every Southern dream. Brown dies, but his myth is born. The aftermath. Within 2 months, Abraham Lincoln condemns slavery more fiercely. Southern militias begin to organize statewide. Newspapers openly speculate on secession, and a new song emerges among Union troops. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Did Brown intend to fail? Many historians now believe Brown knew Harpers Ferry would fail. He needed it to fail gloriously, because if he succeeded quietly, no one would notice. But if he died visibly, righteously, and without apology, he would shame the nation and make silence impossible. You've just listened to MetaFacts Legends, where failure is never the end, but the beginning of myth. John Brown didn't start the Civil War, but he made it unavoidable. In Part 2, Kansas, the rehearsal for Civil War, we go back to the battleground that first taught Brown how to kill, and taught America what was coming. Part 2.1, A Land Divided. Before the Civil War tore the nation apart, Kansas broke first. 1854, Washington, D.C. Senator Stephen A. Douglas steps to the podium. In his hand, a proposal that will change American history. He calls it the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He says it promotes popular sovereignty. He says it's a solution to the question of slavery. He's wrong, because when that bill passes, it doesn't calm the country. It sends thousands of armed men running toward Kansas, not to vote, but to kill. The law that opened the floodgates, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, signed into law by President Franklin Pierce, does one simple but catastrophic thing. It repeals the Missouri Compromise. For over 30 years, the Missouri Compromise had kept slavery out of new territories north of the 36 degrees 30 feet line. Now, that line is gone, and whether Kansas becomes a free state or a slave state is left up to who gets there first. America invents vote with guns. What Douglas called popular sovereignty quickly becomes a race to colonize Kansas with ideology. Anti-slavery families from the North pour in, sponsored by organizations like the New England Emigrant Aid Company. But the South responds faster, harder, with guns. Missouri border ruffians cross into Kansas in waves. They set up fake towns, stage fraudulent elections, intimidate voters, carry pistols into every meeting. By 1855, there are more ballots than people in Kansas. Bleeding begins. Disputes over land boundaries escalate to fistfights, then shootouts, then raids. One anti-slavery settler recalls, "You'd plow a field in the morning and bury your neighbor in the afternoon. Homes are burned, newspapers torched. One man is shot for refusing to say he supports slavery. The federal government says nothing. President Pierce sides with the pro-slavery legislature in Kansas, even though it was installed by blatantly rigged elections. John Brown watches from afar. In 1855, John Brown is still in Ohio, but when his sons, already settled in Kansas, send word of the violence, he doesn't hesitate. He says, the battle is not in Washington. It is in the dust, in the blood, in Kansas. Kansas as the test field. What makes Kansas unique? It is the only place in America in the 1850s where the slavery question is decided not in law, but in combat. Kansas becomes a microcosm of national rage, a rehearsal for irregular warfare, a breeding ground for political terrorism. You want to understand the Civil War? You look at Kansas first. Abolitionists also pick up guns. While the South sends militias, the North sends preachers with rifles in crates labeled Bibles. Anti-slavery settlers organize Jayhawker militias. They raid pro-slavery farms, destroy bridges, assassinate judges. Kansas becomes a battleground with no rules. This isn't protest, this is civil war. Before the Civil War, the day the Senate literally bled. Back in D.C., the situation mirrors the chaos. May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner gives an impassioned speech against the Kansas violence. 2 days later, Southern Congressman Preston Brooks walks into the Senate chamber and beats Sumner with a cane. Until the cane breaks, Sumner bleeds across the floor. Half the Senate applauds, the other half weeps. One newspaper writes, Kansas has bled. Now, Congress bleeds. Brown sees Kansas as Judgment Day. When John Brown arrives in Kansas in late 1855, he doesn't come to vote. He comes to fight. God has made clear, he says, this land must be baptized in fire before it is fit for freedom. He builds a cabin and a covered armory. His sons scout. He trains with sabers, and every night he prays not for peace, but for a holy war. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where history doesn't sleep between the lines, it burns through them. In Kansas, America stopped being an idea and started being a battlefield. And in the next chapter, the border ruffians will follow the men who brought war to the doorstep, and the man who would open it with a sword. Part 2.2 The Border Ruffians. They didn't cross the border with ballots. They came with bullets and burned the vote down. Spring 1856. A cloud of dust moves westward from Missouri. Riding in it, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of armed men. No uniforms, no insignias, Just whiskey, rifles, and a shared purpose. Make Kansas slave, or make it bleed. They call themselves border ruffians. To many in Kansas, they were nothing less than terrorists. And they didn't come to debate. They came to dominate. WHO were the border ruffians. Most were pro-slavery settlers and mercenaries from western Missouri, backed by wealthy plantation owners and southern politicians. But these weren't just poor farmers defending tradition. They were ex-Confederate volunteers, veterans of the Mexican War, criminals looking for bounty, and ideologues who believed slavery was ordained by God. They saw Kansas as a war between the South and extinction. Lose Kansas, lose everything. First they stole the vote, then they stole the peace. The ruffians' first strategy, elect their own legislature. So, on March 30th, 1855, they storm across the border. They cast thousands of illegal votes in key Kansas towns, then leave before sunrise. The result, a pro-slavery legislature takes power. They set up shop in Lecompton, Kansas, and immediately outlaw abolitionist newspapers, criminalize anti-slavery speech, and authorize capital punishment for helping a fugitive slave. Kansas becomes a police state, backed by thugs, and the federal government recognizes it as the legitimate government. The first raid, in late 1855, border ruffians launch their first major attack on the town of Lawrence, a known anti-slavery stronghold. They burn farms, assault women, whip men in the streets, destroy the Free State Hotel and printing press. When asked by a witness what crime the town committed, one ruffian replies, they read, John Brown arrives and sees nothing. After hearing of the Lawrence attack, Brown and his sons rush to the scene. What they find stuns them. No federal troops, no trials, no arrests, only burned buildings and terrified civilians. Brown walks the town in silence. Then he says, the Lord's vengeance is overdue. That night, he begins writing a list. 5 names. WHO protected the ruffians. Here's the darker twist. The ruffians weren't rogue. They were aided and armed by local sheriffs, federal marshals, and even Senator Atchison of Missouri. In one speech to ruffian militias, Atchison says, you are now authorized to go into Kansas and smite the godless abolitionists. Do not hesitate, do not stop, make Kansas Southern, or make it silent. The ruffians cheer. The government turns away. What do you do when your enemy is the law? Brown now faces the greatest moral paradox of his life. He has spent decades believing in justice, in divine order. But now, the law has become a weapon for slavery. Courts are rigged, judges are partisan, churches are silent, presidents are complicit. There is no more justice. He tells his sons, only judgment. Brown prepares to strike. He gathers his sons, loads the wagons, prays aloud, and writes in his journal, the angel of death rides tonight. I will be his horse. He doesn't tell the abolitionists, doesn't ask permission, doesn't wait for politics. He decides 5 must die, so the country may live. And soon, the blood will flow. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where history breaks bones before it makes change. In Kansas, the law was buried in fire, and one man, broken by justice, now prepares to deliver his own. Coming next, Part 2.3 Lawrence Burns, the attack that broke Kansas and unleashed John Brown's sword. Part 2.3 Lawrence Burns. They didn't just destroy a town. They sent a message. Freedom will not be protected. May 21st, 1856, dawn breaks over Lawrence, Kansas, a free state stronghold. The townspeople rise early. Children fetch water. The Herald of Freedom newspaper prepares for print. No one notices the dust cloud until it's too late. Hundreds of men ride in from Missouri, carrying banners, flying pistols, chanting songs of war. They don't come to argue. They come to erase the town. Lawrence, a city built on hope. Founded by northern settlers, Lawrence was envisioned as a shining city on the prairie. It had anti-slavery newspapers, a library, free schools, underground railroad safehouses, but most importantly, no militias. It was a town of peace by design, which made it, in the eyes of the border ruffians, a perfect target. The raid was ordered by the state. Sheriff Samuel Jones, a pro-slavery official appointed by the Pierce administration, declared Lawrence in open rebellion. He assembled a posse of over 800 men, and he had papers signed by the territorial governor, authorizing the raid. This wasn't just a mob. This was state-sanctioned terrorism. The attack, at 10 a.m., they enter the city. Citizens line the streets, unarmed, stunned. They expect arrests, maybe property seizures. Instead, the mob goes building by building. They burn the Free State Hotel to the ground, smash the printing presses of the Kansas Herald and Herald of Freedom, loot stores, whip civilians, threaten to hang the entire city council. One man begs, "We are peaceful. There are children here." The answer, then teach them who rules Kansas. The government knows and stays silent. News of the raid reaches Washington within days. But President Franklin Pierce refuses to condemn it. Instead, he blames the abolitionists for provoking unnecessary tension. No federal troops are sent. No investigation, no apology, and the newspapers split clean down the middle. The New York Times calls it a Southern War on Democracy. The Richmond Inquirer calls it a righteous blow against Northern arrogance. John Brown arrives too late, just hours after the mob leaves. Brown and his sons ride into Lawrence. They find smoldering buildings, charred paper blowing in the wind, women sobbing over broken furniture, and a silence thicker than death. Brown walks the ruins. Then, standing on the blackened steps of the Free State Hotel, he says, "Now I see, there is no country, only the sword." The nonviolent abolitionists beg for restraint. Leaders of the Free State movement urge calm. They send letters to newspapers pleading, "We must not become like them. Let the courts decide." Brown laughs. What court? The one that burned this town. He writes to a friend, "I am weary of words. The Lord speaks now through steel." And that night, he begins planning. Brown writes a list. In his cabin outside Osawatomie, Brown takes a Bible, lays it open beside a blank sheet of paper. He writes down names, farms, affiliation, pro-slavery, last seen actions. His sons look at the list. His youngest asks, "What is this, Father?" Brown replies, "A ledger of justice, and it is time to balance the account." The raid that failed succeeded. No one dies in the Lawrence raid. Not one abolitionist is killed. So why did it matter? Because it broke something deeper. Faith. Faith that laws protected the innocent. Faith that the government was neutral. Faith that America could resolve slavery without war. Brown wasn't radicalized by violence. He was radicalized by cowardice. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where peace burns faster than paper. Lawrence was supposed to be the model of Free State America. Instead, it became a funeral pyre. And now, John Brown will strike back. Coming next, Part 2.4 Pottawatomie Massacre. 5 names, 5 swords, and the scream that would echo across history. Part 2.4 Pottawatomie Massacre. He didn't strike in daylight. He waited for midnight and brought the sword. May 24th, 1856, the Kansas Plains, moonless, quiet. John Brown kneels in the dirt. 5 of his sons stand behind him. They carry broadswords, not guns. He opens a Bible, reads aloud from Psalm chapter 149. Let the high praises of God be in their mouth, and the two-edged sword in their hand. He closes the book, stands. Tonight, he says, the Lord shall have vengeance. Then they disappear into the trees. Why this night? Just 3 days earlier, the pro-slavery raid on Lawrence had reduced a Free State town to rubble. No arrests, no justice, no accountability. Brown saw no path left but divine violence. He had chosen 5 men, each one connected to pro-slavery violence. Each one Brown believed had threatened Free State settlers. "These are not victims," he said, "they are Pharaoh's horsemen, and we are the Red Sea." The massacre begins. The first cabin, James Doyle. Brown knocks. Doyle answers, sees 6 armed men. Brown demands he come outside with his 2 adult sons. They are led into the trees. Brown gives the signal. His sons swing. The swords don't kill cleanly. It takes multiple blows. Bones crack. Flesh tears. The night echoes with gurgling screams. The mother and younger children spared, but not the men. Brown doesn't kill. He orders others to do it. Brown never swings a sword that night, but he directs. He chooses. He watches. When his son Owen hesitates, Brown commands, "Strike, boy, for if you don't, I will." This twist is key. Brown doesn't see himself as executioner. He sees himself as prophet. The sword, to him, is just another tool of scripture. 2 more targets. Next stop, the home of Alan Wilkinson, a local pro-slavery judge. Brown drags him outside. Wilkinson pleads, "I've harmed no one." Brown answers, "You enforced laws that enslave men. That is harm enough." The sword falls. Finally, William Sherman, a known border ruffian informant, found drunk in his cabin, dragged outside, beheaded, his body dumped in the creek. The morning after, when the sun rises, Kansas wakes to horror. 5 dead, no trial, no warning. Newspapers scream. Murderous fanatics butcher innocent men. The South erupts in outrage. The North splinters. And John Brown, he vanishes into the wilderness. Brown never hid. Despite public perception, Brown never denied the killings. He told anyone who asked, "God told me to cleanse this land, and I obeyed." He wrote in a letter, "If I am to be a murderer, let me be one whose blade was clean with justice." WHO was really afraid that morning. The white settlers, yes, but the enslaved black people nearby. They began whispering a new name, Moses. Some began slipping away from plantations because they heard there was a man out there, white but not afraid, willing to do what others only prayed about. One escapee later said, "I saw no angels, but I heard John Brown's sword, and I knew freedom was real." Brown believed he had saved lives. To Brown, the massacre wasn't vengeance. It was deterrence. "I have spilled blood to prevent more from being spilled." He believed that striking hard once would shock the pro-slavery militias into backing off. But instead, it escalated everything. Public backlash. Even his allies recoiled. Frederick Douglass wrote, "A man may be right in principle and wrong in method." William Lloyd Garrison condemned the act. The cause of liberty cannot be built on graves. But others, especially young black activists, defended Brown. "He did what we could not," said one preacher. "He did what was necessary." The cost: the massacre turned Kansas into a full-blown war zone. More raids, more burnings, more killings by both sides. And Brown, now a fugitive, hunted, wounded, but more certain than ever. "They call me butcher," he wrote, "but I see their silence before Lawrence. I see their courts do nothing. If I am mad, then let this nation tremble at what made me so." You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where justice walks a knife's edge and sometimes falls on the wrong side. In the creek that night, 5 bodies sank into history, and 1 man rose into myth. Coming next, Part 2.5: A Hero or a Butcher. As the nation recoils in horror, Brown becomes both a demon in the South, a messiah in the North. Part 2.5: A Hero or a Butcher. He killed 5 men with swords. But what cut deeper was what he revealed about America. Summer 1856. Kansas is silent, but not still. The massacre at Pottawatomie Creek hangs in the air like smoke after battle. No charges, no arrests, just a question. Who was John Brown? A freedom fighter, a fanatic, a savior, a slaughterer? America can't decide. Immediate reactions: North versus South. The South erupts first. Newspapers brand him a murderer. lunatic, terrorist. They publish sketches of his face, wanted posters, editorials demanding his execution. A Georgia paper writes, "If this devil is not hanged, the Union itself deserves to fall." Missouri militia leaders issue a bounty, $3, dead or alive. Meanwhile in the North, confusion, disgust, but also awe. "He did what we all spoke of," said one abolitionist. "He became action incarnate. He becomes a legend without trying." Brown doesn't publish manifestos, doesn't write op-eds. He simply disappears. But in his absence, the myth begins. Churches whisper about the sword of God in Kansas. Runaways leave chalk marks. JB was here. Abolitionist pamphlets print his portrait under the word deliverer. And Brown says nothing. "Let others decide what I am." He tells a friend, "I have more work to do." The press divides the nation. Pro-slavery papers run headlines like, "Fanatic White Devil Butchers Innocents in Night Raid. Northern Savagery Unleashed." Abolitionist outlets respond with, "Kansas, a cry for righteous fury." Brown's blow, the warning they ignored. Brown becomes the first polarizing media icon in American politics. He's not just a man. He's a question with a body count. The biggest split comes from his own side. The abolitionist movement, already fragile, begins to fracture. William Lloyd Garrison denounces the killings. "If our cause needs blood to win, then it is no longer holy." Frederick Douglass, though disturbed, offers a different view. "I cannot approve the method, but I admire the man." Henry David Thoreau, he writes an essay defending Brown. "He did not kill men. He killed apathy." His sons split too. Brown's sons begin to question their father. Owen Brown writes in his journal, "I followed him with a sword, but did I swing for God or for him?" Jason Brown, emotionally broken after Potawatomi, leaves Kansas entirely. The killings didn't just split the nation. They split Brown's family. But John, he remains immovable. "My sons must choose, but the Lord has chosen me." The impact on slave communities. Here's the twist no one saw coming. In the black churches of the North, Brown's name is spoken in prayer. In secret slave meetings across the South, children are told, "A man came. He killed for us. One day, we will meet him in freedom." Escapes increase in regions where rumors of Brown circulate. His very existence becomes a kind of psychological weapon. One plantation overseer in Mississippi writes, "They're unsteady now. They believe someone is coming." Brown's theology hardens. In his isolation, Brown writes, "Christ turned the other cheek. I turn the page to Revelation." He no longer speaks of America as a country. He calls it the broken covenant. He believes slavery is not just a political sin, but a cosmic one, and any fire can cleanse it. The government never pursues him. Despite public outrage, Brown is never arrested. Why? Because officials feared making him a martyr, triggering more violence, provoking northern backlash, so they pretend he's gone. They file away the case, close the ledgers, and say nothing. Leave him to rot. One marshal wrote, "He'll fade," but he doesn't. He festers. He plans. The final transformation. Brown writes to a supporter in Boston, "I've struck once. The next blow will shake the nation." What does he mean? No one knows yet, but in a barn, far from Kansas, he begins gathering maps, recruits, weapons, and a new document, the Provisional Constitution of the United States. He's not trying to reform America anymore. He's replacing it. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where one man's justice is another man's apocalypse. John Brown was no longer just a person. He was a mirror, and what America saw in that mirror terrified her. Coming next, Part 2.6, The Fugitive Prophet. John Brown disappears, but his shadow gets larger. And when he returns, it will be with a constitution and an army. Part 2.6, The Fugitive Prophet. He disappeared from the battlefield, but in the shadows, he began to build a nation. Summer, 1856. America burns with rumors. The man who killed 5 men in Kansas is gone. Some say he fled west. Some say he crossed into Canada. Some say he's dead, but in a barn in North Elba, New York, in the shadow of the Adirondacks. He is very much alive. Writing, planning, praying. His name is John Brown. And the war in his mind has only just begun, vanishing without hiding. After the Potawatomi killings, Brown evades capture with shocking ease. He travels under aliases: Isaac Smith, Shubal Morgan, Nelson Hawkins. He uses the Underground Railroad in reverse, slipping through the same channels used to hide escaped slaves. But here's the twist: he isn't hiding from justice. He's hiding from distraction. He tells his daughter, "Let them call me a ghost. The next time I appear, it will be as fire." Kansas continues to bleed. Meanwhile, Kansas spirals further into chaos. Dozens more die in raids and ambushes. Churches are burned. Politicians flee the territory altogether. The phrase "bleeding Kansas" becomes common in national newspapers. And yet, John Brown says nothing. Until one night, sitting by a fire with Frederick Douglass, he speaks. This country must see blood on its own doorstep. Not in the territories, in the heart of the Republic. Douglass stares. Brown continues. We must strike at the government's very bones. He writes a new constitution. In 1858, Brown travels to Chatham, Ontario, a small town with a large free black community. There, he gathers 46 black men and women, along with white supporters, into a hidden convention. What they do shocks even his closest allies. They draft a provisional constitution of the United States of America. This is not a symbolic protest. It is a government in exile, a rejection of Washington, a declaration of war. Brown reads it aloud, saying, "Since the Union has betrayed freedom, we shall build one that honors it." He doesn't plan to take over America. He plans to abandon it. Brown's goal is not political office, not a seat in Congress, not an amendment. He wants to create a shadow nation, hidden in the Appalachian Mountains, made of freed slaves, governed by his new constitution, armed, mobile, unbreakable. He calls it the Subterranean Passway. It is part Underground Railroad, part Revolutionary Army, the Army of the Underground. In the next year, Brown quietly recruits men across the North. Free black farmers, escaped slaves, white radicals, veterans, preachers with pistols under their robes. He trains them in small groups, teaches guerrilla warfare, map reading, tactical withdrawal, discipline based on Exodus, not West Point. They call him Captain Brown, the Secret Six. Meanwhile, in Boston and New York, a secret group of wealthy abolitionists hears of Brown's plans. They are Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Gerrit Smith, Samuel Howe, George Stearns, Theodore Parker, Franklin Sanborn. Together, they form the Secret Six. They fund Brown's vision: money, guns, printing presses, supporters, and all in silence. They believe, if Brown fails, we disavow. But if he ignites something, we were the spark, the strategy behind the madness. What Brown plans seems insane. Seize a federal armory at Harpers Ferry, arm thousands of slaves, spark a nationwide uprising, retreat to the mountains, wage endless insurgency. But Brown is not delusional. He has studied geography, supply routes, communication networks, psychological warfare. He believes, if we strike quickly, visibly, and righteously, the people will follow. He doesn't seek victory in weeks. He seeks irreversibility, the final preparations. By mid-1859, Brown has over 950 pikes, hundreds of rifles, dozens of trained men, maps of Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, and escape trails. He rents a farmhouse 5 miles from Harpers Ferry under an alias. There, he trains his men, not just in combat, but in conviction. This is not an army, he says. This is a gospel with bullets. Why Harpers Ferry? Because it is a U.S. federal arsenal, lightly guarded, surrounded by enslaved communities, near mountains for escape. a symbolic heart of government force. It is Pharaoh's chariot house, and Brown intends to burn it. You've been listening to MetaFacts Legends, where justice doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it carries a sword in the dark. John Brown is no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer waiting for someone else. He has a constitution, an army, a list of names, and in the next chapter, he walks toward Harpers Ferry. Part 3.1, a plan in the shadows. He wasn't building a militia. He was building a prophecy. The year is 1859. Somewhere in the rolling fields of Maryland, 5 miles from Harpers Ferry, a ramshackle farmhouse stands. Its windows are shuttered. Its chimney smokes at night. Its barn creaks, not from livestock, but from weapons being unloaded in silence. Inside are crates of rifles, pikes, maps, and one old man with burning eyes. His name is John Brown, and he is about to declare war on the United States. The setting, Maryland's quiet stage. Brown has chosen this farmhouse with surgical precision. It's just across the Potomac River from Harpers Ferry. It has access to woods, escape trails, and backwater roads. Nearby farms are worked by enslaved laborers, the very people Brown hopes to own. To the locals, Brown is a quiet, slightly odd wool merchant named Isaac Smith. But every night, behind closed doors, he trains men for battle, reads scripture by lantern light, and sketches the blueprint of something far bigger than a raid. This isn't a plan for victory, it's a plan for shock. Here's the twist. Even Brown's most loyal followers don't quite understand what they've signed up for. He tells them, "We will strike a blow so righteous, even its failure will shake the earth." He doesn't expect to survive. He doesn't expect to hold territory. He wants to trigger a cascade, moral, emotional, and political. In other words, he's not launching a war. He's igniting a revelation. The 21. Brown carefully selects his force. 21 men, including 5 black men, 2 formerly enslaved, and several of his sons. Ages range from 17 to 45. Professions: farmer, teacher, fugitive, preacher, soldier. Most have never been in battle. One follower, John Cargy, writes, "We are not trained, but we are willing," and that is enough for him. Another, Dangerfield Newby, a freedman hoping to rescue his wife from slavery, says, "He offered me a weapon. No white man had ever offered me anything but chains." Brown doesn't recruit men. He calls them, like a prophet naming apostles. Brown isn't just targeting the armory. He's writing a constitution. Yes, you read that right. Inside the farmhouse, he's not only preparing weapons, he's finalizing a provisional constitution of the United States, drafted months earlier in Canada. It includes a preamble condemning slavery as sin, articles establishing a new executive, judiciary, and legislative structure, provisions for abolitionist courts, a declaration of armed resistance as a divine right. He intends to implement this in free territory carved out in the mountains of Virginia. This isn't just rebellion, it's a parallel republic, training in the dark. Each night, Brown drills his men, hand-to-hand combat, rifle handling, how to retreat without panic, reading maps by moonlight, but also reading scripture, singing spirituals, memorizing quotes from Exodus and Revelation. This is not a war of bullets. He tells them, it is a war of belief. He teaches that they are not soldiers, they are instruments of judgment. The plan is already cracking. Several men begin to question Brown's logic. There is no clear escape plan. The arsenal is more heavily guarded than expected. The idea that thousands of slaves will rise up instantly seems unlikely. One follower, John Cook, warns, "They may not come. They may be too afraid, or not even hear us." Brown responds, "Then let them hear our deaths. Let it echo." This isn't bravado. It's belief. The arsenal, a temple of gunpowder. Harpers Ferry arsenal contains over 100.00 weapons, multiple buildings, a central engine house, proximity to rail lines and river crossings. Brown's plan, Seize the armory quietly, hold it long enough to arm freedmen. Retreat to the hills, spark an expanding insurrection. It is both audacious and insane. And it is already set in motion. He delays, on purpose. The original plan was to strike in late summer. But Brown waits. He wants to be sure. He prays daily for a sign. His delay causes friction. One son asks, "Are we waiting for victory, Father, or for martyrdom?" Brown replies, "Is there a difference?" The final meal. On October 15th, 1859, Brown prepares his men one last time. They share a meal of cornbread, salt pork, beans, coffee. He reads aloud, "Blessed are they who were persecuted for righteousness' sake." Then he asks each man, "Will you walk into the fire and not turn back?" All say yes, all know they might die, all believe, or try to. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where revolutions aren't made with banners, but with bones. In a farmhouse in Maryland, 21 men lit a fuse, not for conquest, but for conviction. And in the next chapter, part 3.2, The Eve of Fire, they will pray their last prayer, write their last letters, and step into American legend. Part 3.2, The Eve of Fire. He didn't ask who wanted to live. He asked, who was ready to die for the unborn? October 16th, 1859. A cold wind scrapes the windows of the Kennedy farmhouse in Maryland. Inside, 21 men, not sleeping, not speaking, waiting. Outside, 5 miles away, Harpers Ferry, a small federal arsenal, lightly guarded, quiet, unaware. It is the last calm hour before the world tilts. John Brown sits at the table. Before him, a Bible, a letter, and a list of names. He folds his hands and says, "Gentlemen, let us pray." WHO were these men. They were not mercenaries, not soldiers of fortune. They were believers. Dangerfield Newby, a freed black man fighting to rescue his enslaved wife and children. John Cargy, Brown's chief of staff, sharp-tongued and loyal. Lewis Leary, black saddler and poet. William Thompson, Brown's quiet, newlywed son-in-law. Oliver and Watson Brown, Brown's own sons, aged 20 and 24. Some were idealists, some were desperate, all were volunteers. They were never promised survival. Brown never sugar-coated the mission. "I cannot promise life, I can only promise meaning." Each man had already written his will. Each had written a final letter, many addressed to mothers, wives, unborn children. "Tell my boy," wrote one, "that his father died not as a soldier, but as a free man who cannot be silent." The final sermon. After the meal, Brown opens a worn Bible. He reads from Hebrews chapter 11, the faith chapter. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. He closes the book, stands. "This is not a war for land. It is a war for the soul of this country. And tonight, we walk into the furnace." They could have backed out, but no one did. One man, John Cook, begins to panic. He says, "Captain, what if no one joins us? What if we're alone?" Brown places a hand on his shoulder. "We will not be alone. The eyes of every slave in this nation are watching. The ears of unborn generations are listening." Then, quietly, Cook picks up his rifle. The letter to the future. Brown pulls out a final sheet of paper. He begins writing, "To whomever survives me, I do not regret one step. I have no shame. If I fall, tell them, I died believing that justice is worth dying for." He signs it, "John Brown, God is my judge." The final checklist. Weapons oiled. Pikes counted, 950. Uniforms, none. Food, only enough for 2 days. Maps, 1 per squad. Escape plan, retreat into the Blue Ridge Mountains. But here's the twist. Brown knows this plan is flawed. He knows the odds are astronomical. He knows Washington can respond within 24 hours. So why proceed? Because for Brown, failure is not defeat. It is revelation. The Secret Six panic. Meanwhile, in Boston, the Secret Six, Brown's wealthy backers, begin to feel uneasy. Rumors spread. One of them, Franklin Sanborn, writes, "John has not written. We fear the strike may come soon, and with it, exposure. They consider burning their correspondence, denying knowledge, fleeing to Canada, because if Brown succeeds, they are heroes. But if he fails, they are traitors." The moment of choice, at 6:45 p.m. Brown gathers his men. The sun sets. He says, "Brothers, if you would rather leave, no shame shall fall on you. This is not a command. It is a covenant. No one moves." Then his son, Oliver, steps forward. "Let us go. Father, let us be what they cannot forget." A last gesture, the final photograph. Earlier that month, several of the men had posed for a daguerreotype. In the image, Brown at the center, his sons beside him, Newby and Leary standing tall. Their faces, calm, clear, defined. None of them will survive the week. The photo will be published after their deaths and hung in abolitionist churches like a saint's icon. The final words before the march. At 8 p.m., Brown stands at the door. He turns to the group and says, "When we cross that river, we are not men. We are the memory of men who would not wait." He leads the way out. One by one, they follow, into the dark, toward Harpers Ferry, toward history. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where the last breath before the fire matters more than the fire itself. 21 men marched without a nation, but with a scripture, a sword, and a name that history would never forget. Coming next, Part 3.3, storming Harpers Ferry. The gates will open, the bullets will fly, and within 36 hours, 10 of them will be dead. Part 3.3, storming Harpers Ferry. They crossed the river expecting to change history, but the first thing they lost was time. October 16th, 1859, 8:30 p.m. The Potomac River glistens under a silver moon. John Brown and his men cross a narrow wooden bridge leading into Harpers Ferry, Virginia. No drums, no banners, no baffled cries, just 21 shadows, armed with rifles, pikes, and belief. They are not an army. They are a declaration with legs. The target, the United States Federal Armory. Harpers Ferry is home to one of two major federal arsenals in the country. It houses over 100.000 firearms and sabers, dozens of buildings, the U.S. Armory, the Rifle Factory, a fire engine house, known later as John Brown's Fort. It is lightly guarded, fewer than 10 full-time personnel. To Brown, it is a keyhole into the heart of American slavery. Open the gate here, and the whole system, he believes, might collapse. They take the armory without a fight. By midnight, Brown's team controls the bridges, the arsenal, and the surrounding area. They cut telegraph wires, detain the night watchman, secure the engine house, station men at critical junctions. Not a single shot fired. John Brown smiles. It has begun. Brown takes hostages, including a Washington. To prevent retaliation and buy time, Brown captures several prominent citizens. Among them, Colonel Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington himself. Brown treats him politely, feeds him, even allows him to write letters. But the symbolism is clear. The founder of your nation held men in chains. Brown says, tonight, one of his blood is held for freedom. Time, the enemy he never counted on. Brown had planned a quick seizure, a rapid call to arms, immediate desertions by local slaves, a withdrawal into the mountains within 6 to 12 hours. But something happens, or rather, something doesn't. No slaves come, no allies arrive, no uprising begins. Why no one came? Because fear is stronger than fire. Local slaves, many of whom heard rumors, stay hidden. Why? Some think it's a trap. Others have no way to get there. Some masters lock them up. Many simply don't believe anything can change. One escaped slave later said, "We heard, but we thought, it's a lie. No white man would die for us." The first death is a black man. At 1:30 a.m., a Baltimore and Ohio train approaches the bridge. Brown's men halted. One of the train's workers, Hayward Shepherd, a free black man, panics and runs. A shot is fired, by accident or fear. He's hit. He becomes the first casualty of John Brown's revolution. A free black man, killed by abolitionists. The irony is devastating, and the myth is already compromised. Dawn comes, and with it, chaos. By sunrise, townspeople wake, see armed men at every corner, hear rumors of a slave revolt. They grab their own rifles, form militias, begin shooting from rooftops and windows. Brown's men return fire, but lack coordination. 2 of them are quickly killed, another wounded. The element of surprise is gone. The town is now a battlefield. Brown refuses to leave. Several of his men beg him to withdraw. We've made our point, Captain. Let's go to the hills. But Brown refuses. He believes God will send them reinforcements. We hold fast. The people are coming, but they aren't. The telegraph lives. Despite Brown's efforts, 1 telegraph line survives. By 10 a.m., news of the raid reaches Washington, D.C., Richmond, Baltimore, Federal Military Command. The government responds immediately. Within hours, troops are mobilizing, and they are not coming to negotiate. Tragedy inside the fort. Brown and his surviving men barricade themselves in the fire engine house. It becomes a final redoubt, a makeshift hospital, a chapel of death. One of Brown's sons, Watson, lies groaning, gut shot, dying slowly. Another, Oliver, is shot in the chest, cradled in Brown's arms. Die brave, Brown whispers, and your blood will wash their chains. The death count rises. By the end of the day, 10 of Brown's 21 men are dead or dying. 5 townspeople are killed. The town is in lockdown. Local militias surround the arsenal, and the US Marines are en route. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where revolutions don't roar, they bleed. John Brown seized the gates of Harpers Ferry, but he never captured what he truly wanted, a nation ready to rise. Coming next, Part 3.4, waiting for an uprising that never came. As bullets fly, Brown waits, not for victory, but for a miracle. Part 3.4, waiting for an uprising that never came. He held the gates open, but no one ran through. October 17th, 1859, 4:15 a.m. Inside the fire engine house at Harpers Ferry, blood pours on the floor. Brown's men are wounded, tired, hungry. They have seized the arsenal. They hold hostages. They've made the newspapers. But something is missing. The people they came to free are not here. John Brown looks toward the hills. Still nothing. The plan that relied on faith. Brown's plan depended on one impossible thing. That enslaved people, beaten, hunted, traumatized, would rise in the moment they saw a chance. He believed hundreds would flee plantations. Thousands would march toward the arsenal. The mountains would echo with freedom songs. He believed this because he thought, freedom is an instinct. All they need is a spark. But freedom is also fear. And sometimes, fear wins. Why did no one come? The answers are many and heartbreaking. Disbelief. Most thought the rumors of an uprising were traps. Surveillance. Planters had already locked down their estates. Isolation. Brown had no way to spread the word quickly. History. Every past revolt, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, had ended in slaughter. One local slave would later say, "We heard, but we knew what happened to those who ran." Brown's greatest strength was his greatest blindness. Brown believed so deeply in divine justice that he assumed everyone else was ready to act on it. But trauma doesn't move on command. It freezes, it hides, it waits, and so the savior stood alone. Inside the engine house, a shrine of pain. By dawn, the engine house is more than fort. Watson Brown bleeds from a stomach wound, calling out for water. Oliver Brown is barely breathing. Dangerfield newbie lies dead outside, his body mutilated by townspeople, ears cut off and displayed on a post. 2 other men pray in whispers. Too weak to reload, Brown holds Watson's hand. You die for the right cause. Son, you're live again. Watson whispers. Will anyone remember? The hostages begin to turn. Brown had hoped to use local elites as bargaining chips. But as time passes, and no uprising comes, the hostages realize he's losing. They start whispering to each other. One tries to overpower a guard. Another, Colonel Washington, begins negotiating with local militias. The tide is turning, and Brown can feel it. Brown still refuses to flee. His men beg him to retreat into the hills. They know the army is coming. They know the telegraph line got through. But Brown says, I will not abandon the arsenal. I will not slink into the woods like a thief. I would rather die here than live with doubt. The Secret Six panic and disappear. Up north, the Secret Six, Brown's wealthy backers, read the headlines with horror. Stearns flees to Canada. Sanborn burns letters. Howe sends a lawyer, but too late. They had hoped for a symbol, but what they got was a siege, and none dared defend it. Yet, John Brown's final belief, as night falls again, Brown writes a letter, meant for Frederick Douglass. He never finishes it, but in it, he writes, I still believe they will come. If not tonight, then after I fall. For someone must fall, before others stand. The slaves did hear him, but too late. In nearby counties, news spreads too slowly. Some slaves begin sneaking out. Others form groups, ready to flee. But by then, Harpers Ferry is surrounded. The window has closed. One slave would say years later, he called us. We heard him. But the chains were too loud that day. Morning comes, and sitters the Marine Corps. October 18th, dawn, the U.S. Marines arrive. Among them, Colonel Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart. They take positions around the arsenal. They send a white flag, offer terms. Brown replies, I prefer death to surrender. Lee gives the order, take him alive. If you can. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where revolutions don't just fail, they echo. John Brown opened the door, but no one walked through. And so, the next door would be carved in blood. Coming next, Part 3.5 Surrounded. The final assault begins, the suns fall, and Brown meets the man who would one day lead the Confederacy. Part 3.5 Surrounded. He walked into Harpers Ferry believing he'd start a revolution. He left in chains, but dragged a nation behind him. October 18th, 1859. Dawn. The rain has stopped. Smoke clings to the streets of Harpers Ferry. Inside the fire engine house, John Brown is bleeding. Two of his sons lie dying beside him. His remaining men, cold, quiet, low on ammunition. Outside, the U.S. Marines have arrived. And they're not interested in negotiation. Commanding the Marines, Colonel Robert E. Lee. Yes, that Robert E. Lee. At the time, he's still a respected officer of the U.S. Army. Not yet the Confederate legend. He has been personally ordered by President Buchanan to retake the arsenal and capture Brown alive if possible. Alongside him, Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart, who will later become one of the Confederacy's most feared cavalry leaders. But today, they stand under the American flag, sent to crush the most radical abolitionist in the country. The standoff, Lee sends Stewart to negotiate. Stewart approaches the engine house under a white flag. He shouts, Mr. Brown, you are surrounded. Surrender now, and you will be treated with dignity. Brown steps to the door, blood staining his beard. He replies, I trust no promise from a government that keeps men in chains. Stewart warns, then we will come in. Brown, so be it. The final assault. At 7 a.m., the order is given. A detachment of Marines charges the engine house door with a 10-foot ladder used as a battering ram. On the third strike, the door splinters inward. Gunfire erupts from inside. Smoke, screams, then steel. Within minutes, it's over. 1 Marine dead, 2 wounded. 10 of Brown's followers killed. The rest, captured or dying. Brown himself is struck by a saber and bayoneted twice. Once in the chest, once in the back, but he doesn't die. Brown refuses to fight back. During the charge, Brown is armed, but he doesn't shoot, doesn't run. He stands, bleeding, and says, "I am ready to answer for what I've done." The Marines seize him, stunned that he's still alive. The town wants blood, immediately. As Brown is dragged from the wreckage, townspeople scream, "Hang him now, shoot him where he stands. He murdered our kin." One man lunges at him with a bayonet, and is stopped only by a Marine officer. The army, ironically, becomes his protector. He is a prisoner of the United States. Lee declares, "You will not touch him." In this moment, John Brown, once the most wanted man in America, is protected by the very government he attacked. The sons die. In the aftermath, Watson Brown dies from gut wounds. Groaning for hours, Oliver Brown dies in his father's arms. Before Oliver slips away, he whispers, "Was it worth it?" John doesn't answer, just presses a hand to his forehead and keeps praying. The world finally sees John Brown's face. Reporters arrive, sketch artists, photographers, and suddenly, the world sees a bloodied old man with white hair, torn clothes, and fire in his eyes, who speaks softly, even to his captors. He's not a monster. He's not insane. He is haunting. The government wanted him dead. Now it doesn't. At first, authorities planned to kill him immediately. Try him, hang him, erase him. But something shifts. Brown's quiet dignity unnerves them. His calm, his injuries, his refusal to run. Lee himself recommends a formal trial. Why? Because they realize, if we kill him in the street, he becomes legend. Better to bury him in paperwork. Brown's final words that morning, before being carried to jail. Brown says to a Marine, "You may defeat me here, but a stronger voice than mine will rise from this blood." The soldier stares. Later, he writes in his diary, "I had the strangest thought, that we had just taken a prophet." You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where bullets end battles, but not stories. John Brown is beaten. His sons are dead. His revolution lies in ruins. But somehow, the real war is only just beginning. Coming next, Part 3.6, Captured Alive. The trial that shocked the nation, and the man who preached from the gallows. Part 3.6, Captured Alive. They took his sword, but they gave him a stage. October 19th, 1859, Charlestown, Virginia. John Brown lies on a cot in the jailhouse infirmary. His chest is pierced, his back is torn. He cannot stand without assistance. Outside, the town prepares for trial. Inside, he prepares for something far more dangerous than execution. They thought they'd silenced him, but they just handed him a microphone. The Commonwealth of Virginia brings 3 charges: treason, inciting slave insurrection, murder. The trial is rushed, the outcome predetermined. The goal, bury him before he can speak. But John Brown, half dead, refuses to shut up. The judge's verses, the word. The trial begins on October 27th. The courtroom is packed. Reporters from every northern and southern paper. Townspeople carrying pistols in their coats. U.S. Marshals guarding every door. Brown is wheeled in, literally. He cannot walk, and yet, he commands the room. His first words, "If this court will give me the chance, I would like to speak truth before I die." He doesn't deny anything. Brown admits to everything. "Yes, I took the arsenal. Yes, I planned to arm the enslaved. Yes, I knew it could end in death. But then comes the twist. I never intended to commit murder. I intended to stop a greater one." The judge blares. The gallery falls silent. The South sees a madman. The North sees a martyr. Southern newspapers call him a traitor, a lunatic, a butcher of peace. But in the North, something strange happens. His words spread faster than bullets. Reprinted in Boston, Chicago, and New York. Sermons crafted around his speeches. Pamphlets with his quotes mailed to churches and colleges. And every word seems to carry fire. The testimony that shook Lincoln. One of the trial transcripts reaches Illinois. A rising politician named Abraham Lincoln reads Brown's declaration. He says, "I do not agree with him, but I do believe him." Brown, in chains, is now influencing the future president of the United States. The final speech, November 2nd, 1859. The jury takes less than 45 minutes to find him guilty. The judge asks if he has anything to say. What follows becomes legend. Brown stands, painfully, bleeding, and says, "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of millions in this slave country, I say, let it be done." The room is frozen. Some weep, others clench fists. No one forgets. He becomes a celebrity in his cell. While awaiting execution, Brown writes dozens of letters, receives hundreds of visitors, responds to students, pastors, strangers, converts jail guards to his cause. One journalist writes, "He is more alive inside his cell than we are outside it." Another, "If Christ had been a soldier, he'd look like John Brown now." A nation asks, "What if he's right?" Northern ministers begin preaching not against violence, but against silence. They don't say, "Do what Brown did." They say, "Brown died because we didn't act sooner." And in slave quarters across the South, a name begins to spread, whispered like a spell. Old Osawatomi, the white man who killed for us. The poem that sparked a movement. Shortly before his death, Brown receives a letter from a young abolitionist. It contains a poem. He smiles and copies it by hand to send to his wife. That poem, John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. It becomes a hymn for the Union Army, and eventually, the baffled cry of the Civil War. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where trials don't end stories. They expose the truth beneath them. John Brown stood before the law, and instead of begging for mercy, he put the entire nation on trial. Coming next, Part 3.7, The Trial of a Nation. As his execution looms, Brown's final words do what his weapons could not: set the conscience of America on fire. Part 3.7, The Trial of a Nation. He stood in chains, but everyone else was on trial. November 1859, Charlestown, Virginia. Outside the jail, armed guards, angry mobs, and Southern politicians sharpening speeches. Inside, John Brown writes letter after letter with blood-stained hands. He is no longer trying to save himself. He is trying to ignite something bigger. He wasn't waiting to be hanged. He was still fighting. From his cell, Brown sends out more than 100 letters in the final 3 weeks before his execution. Letters to abolitionists in Boston, black preachers in Philadelphia, politicians in Illinois, editors in New York, children in Ohio. Each letter carefully written, signed, "Yours for liberty, John Brown, God is my judge." Virginia gives him a public platform, and it backfires. Virginia's leaders thought a public trial and execution would humiliate Brown. But the more he spoke, the more he became a myth. His composure, his wit, his scripture-laced arguments. "I do not ask to be spared. I ask to be heard." And America listened. In the North, pulpits turn into battle stations. In churches from New England to Chicago, ministers read Brown's words from the pulpit. Some wept, some slammed fists on their lecterns. Some called for national repentance. Abolitionist leader Wendell Phillips declared, "Brown has made the gallows glorious, like the cross." But in the South, panic sets in. Southern newspapers print nothing but rage. The North glorifies a murderer. This proves the Yankees want to destroy us. Plantation owners arm their slaves, not to fight, but to watch them. Militias drill nightly. State governors beg the federal government for more weapons. Virginia mobilizes 1.50 troops just to keep peace on the day of the hanging. Brown is calm because he believes he's already won. To his lawyers, Brown says, "My death will do more than my life ever could." To a reporter, "I am not the beginning. I am the bell. What answers it will shake the earth." Brown's last letter to his wife. On November 30th, he writes to Mary Brown, "My dearest, I am quite cheerful, my wounds are healing, and my mind is at peace. If it be so that I am to be hung, I trust God will give me grace to endure it, and that he will sanctify it to the good of the cause." He adds, "Kiss our children, tell them father believed in something too much to live in fear." Abraham Lincoln responds, in whispers. Privately, Lincoln tells a colleague, Brown was wrong in method, but right in moral. He fears praising Brown publicly could fracture the Republican Party, but he can't look away. He may have opened the door, Lincoln says, and no one alive will be able to close it. The nation divides, a line written in blood. In December 1859, two Americas emerge, one where John Brown is a martyr, one where he is a madman. And in between, silence, tension, gunpowder, for many slaves. This was the first time a white man died for them. Word spreads, even in plantations. One enslaved woman in Georgia recalls, "They say a white man went to the gallows, not for stealing, not for killing, but for us." And in the months that follow, more escape attempts, more uprisings, more fear in Southern households. John Brown is dead to the state, but alive in the shadows. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where gallows don't just end lives, they reveal legacies. John Brown didn't break the nation. He exposed that it was already broken. Coming next, Part 3.8, The Hanging That Shook the Union. One man, one road, and the moment when silence became impossible. Part 3.8, The Hanging That Shook the Union. He climbed the scaffold alone, but the whole nation stood with him, or against him. December 2nd, 1859, Charlestown, Virginia. The sky is steel gray. Wind cuts like knives. Frost coats the dirt roads. It is the morning of a hanging. But no one in the crowd came to see a criminal. They came to see a question be answered. The most guarded execution in U.S. history. Virginia is in panic. Governor Henry Wise deploys 1.500 troops. Cavalry surrounding the town. Sharpshooters on rooftops. Artillery units positioned on nearby hills. Why? Because they're not afraid of John Brown. They're afraid of what might rise from his grave. John Brown is calmer than anyone else. Inside his jail cell, Brown rises at dawn. He eats half a slice of toast, a small cup of coffee. He reads from his Bible, then writes his final note, handed to a guard minutes before he steps out. It reads, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." He folds it, smiles, then says, "Let us go." The march to the gallows. Brown is placed in a wagon. He refuses a blindfold as he rides through the streets. Soldiers line the road. Civilians, silenced by all, remove their hats. One woman faints. A child whispers, "Is that the man who tried to free the slaves?" A soldier murmurs, "He looks like he already saw heaven." Even his enemies stand still. Among the observers, Robert E. Lee, unofficially present, J.E.B. Stewart, multiple Southern judges, legislators, pro-slavery pastors who came to rejoice. And yet, no one cheers. The air is too heavy. The silence is suffocating. The last step. Brown climbs the gallows without assistance. The executioner adjusts the noose. A preacher asks if he has any last words. Brown replies, "I am ready. I am at peace. I die believing that others will finish what I began." The drop. At 11:15 a.m., the trapdoor opens. John Brown falls. Silence. Then, a creak. Then, nothing. He hangs for nearly 7 minutes before pronounced dead. And with that, the nation exhales. But the country never recovers. Within 24 hours, newspapers explode. Pamphlets circulate. Artists sketch the scene. Preachers quote his final letter from the pulpit. Northern presses call it the crucifixion of liberty. Southern presses call it a traitor sent to hell. But the people, they remember the silence, the calm, the final walk, the man who did not flinch. John Brown's body travels, and sparks fires. His coffin is shipped quietly back to North Elba, New York, as the wagon rolls through northern towns. Bells toll, schools dismiss, black Americans line the roads. White farmers stand in silence. Children toss flowers onto the path. One witness writes, "It was like a king had died, but no kingdom would claim him." The aftershock, from hanging to hymns. Within weeks, churches across the North begin singing a new hymn. John Brown's body lies mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. It spreads like wildfire, from black churches to Union training camps. And 2 years later, the Union Army marches into battle, singing his name. Lincoln whispers a warning. Privately, Abraham Lincoln writes, "John Brown may have been wrong, but now, we must answer the question his death has asked us." 3 months later, Lincoln becomes president. 5 months after that, the Civil War begins. The South got what it feared most. They thought killing John Brown would restore order. Instead, they galvanized abolitionists, radically polarized the Union, made Brown the symbol of divine defiance. What they executed wasn't a man, it was a mirror, and when America looked into it, it could no longer lie to itself. You've just heard MetaFacts legends, where men don't just die. They divide history. John Brown fell from a scaffold and shook the Union to its core. But his true legacy was never about the arsenal he seized. It was about the conscience he forced a nation to confront. Because long after his body turned cold, his question remained red hot. Was I a terrorist, or the only one who dared to tell the truth out loud? Coming next, psychology and legacy, the madman who made a nation feel again. Part 4.1 The God Inside John Brown. He didn't say God spoke to him. He said he was God's sword. Most men pray to God. John Brown answered him. Was he crazy? Or just correct too early? In his lifetime, John Brown was called a fanatic, a prophet, a lunatic, a saint, a terrorist. But he never wavered. I act under the authority of Almighty God. He wrote, not man, not government, not compromise. He didn't see the Bible as a metaphor. He saw it as a battlefield map. And he believed his blood was part of the plan. Deep dive, religion as mission, not comfort. John Brown's theology wasn't peaceful. It wasn't contemplative. It was combative. His family prayed in silence every morning, with weapons beside the table. He raised his children to memorize scripture and gunpowder recipes. He believed that Exodus and Revelation weren't just books, they were orders. To Brown, slavery was not just political sin, it was cosmic rebellion. And I am chosen to strike Egypt, a family built for war. Brown had 20 children. He taught them that justice may require your death, that a sword is holy when it frees the oppressed, that to stand silent in the face of evil is to become evil. His son Jason Brown later said, "We never saw father relax. Even our dinners were sermons." His daughter remembered, he'd pray with tears in his eyes and the rifle across his knees. John Brown believed failure was part of God's plan. Unlike revolutionaries who aim for victory, Brown believed, if I win, God is just. If I die, God is still just. And either way, the sin of America is exposed. That's why he refused rescue in prison. He rejected escape plans from abolitionists. He walked to the gallows in silence. Because, to him, martyrdom is not a loss. It is a megaphone. I am worth infinitely more to die than to live. This line, in a letter from jail, is often cited as madness. But from Brown's perspective, it was logic. His death would force the nation to pick a side. His body would be buried, but his cause would be sung. His gallows would become a pulpit, and history proved him right. His God was not merciful, he was righteously angry. Most Christians in 1859 believed Jesus is love, patience, forgiveness. Brown believed Jesus turned over the tables. He cursed the hypocrites. He bled. Brown's favorite book, Revelation, his favorite verse, I saw heaven opened, and behold a white horse. He that sat upon him was called Faithful and True. In righteousness, he doth judge and make war. Brown wasn't insane. He was absolutely consistent. Modern psychologists have studied his writings. No evidence of psychosis, no hallucinations, no personality breaks, just unyielding moral clarity. One historian wrote, Brown wasn't insane. He simply believed what others claimed to believe, and acted on it. Douglas said, he lived in the Bible. Frederick Douglass, who respected, but feared Brown, said, he read the Old Testament like it was current events. He saw every pharaoh as a senator, every Egypt as America. To Douglas, Brown was terrifyingly pure, uncompromising, deadly honest. His radicalism wasn't anti-white, it was anti-cowardice. Many Northerners feared Brown not for his violence, but for his moral clarity. He made him feel cowardly. He acted, we talked. He struck, we speculated. He died, we published. That's why many respected him, but distanced themselves. The man WHO prayed before he killed. In Kansas, before he killed 5 pro-slavery men at Pottawatomie Creek, he prayed, sang hymns, asked his sons, if this be righteous, then let it be done. Even in horror, he believed he was not acting, but obeying. And if he was wrong, he was willing to face divine judgment. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where belief isn't always beautiful. Sometimes, it wears boots, bears scars, and walks toward death with a Bible in hand. John Brown did not ask, is this legal? He asked, is this righteous? And in our next chapter, Part 4.2, A White Man with Black Blood, we'll see how Brown became the only white man millions of slaves ever trusted, even though they never met him. Part 4.2, A White Man with Black Blood. He never wore chains, but he carried them deeper than anyone else. Frederick Douglass once said, he was the first white man I ever met, who did not want to be thanked for believing I was human. In a time when most whites saw blacks as property, John Brown called them brothers. While senators debated, while abolitionists published essays, while pastors prayed for patience, John Brown acted, but not as a savior, as an equal. The early years, growing up different. John Brown was born into a deeply religious, anti-slavery family. At age 12, he befriends a black boy named Cyrus and witnesses him being beaten for not bowing to a white man. Brown never forgets that moment. He later wrote, burned a scar on my soul that no time could erase. At 16, he vows, I will break the yoke or die with those who bear it. The League of Gileadites, early underground action. Before Harpers Ferry, before Kansas, before blood, Brown founded the League of Gileadites in Springfield, Massachusetts. Purpose: to protect escaped slaves from being captured under the Fugitive Slave Act. He trained free black men in self-defense, in legal rights, in mental courage. He didn't lead them, he stood with them. Brown never wrote about helping black people. He wrote about joining them. In a letter to his son, he says, I do not fight for the slave. I fight with him. I fight because our chains are the same. Only mine are invisible. In his camp, black men were officers, not followers. At Harpers Ferry, among his 21 men, 5 were black, 2 were born into slavery, 3 were appointed as captains. Dangerfield Newby, a freedman whose wife was still enslaved, said, no one ever gave me a weapon before. Brown gave me 2, and asked for my orders. He didn't see them as tools. He saw them as equals in blood, mind, and eternity. Even the enslaved WHO never met him, called him our Moses. In the months after his hanging, word spread among the enslaved South that a white man had died for them, that he never asked for payment, that he cried for their children, that he bled like they did, in whispered prayers and secret songs. They said, Moses has crossed over. Brown, who never freed more than a few dozen slaves directly, freed something else, their belief that someone white could love them without condition. Frederick Douglass almost joined him, but couldn't. Frederick Douglass admired Brown deeply, but when Brown shared his plan for Harpers Ferry, Douglass said, "It is a perfect steel trap. Once sprung, no escape." He refused to join. Years later, he wept as he recalled. He asked me to ride with him. I said no, and now I carry that weight, the only white man allowed into black heaven. Some Southern enslaved people had a belief that in the afterlife, no white man could enter paradise. But after John Brown's execution, something changed. A minister reported. I asked an old woman if she believed Brother Brown went to heaven. She looked at me and said, "No, sir, he didn't go to heaven. He opened a new one, just for folks like him." No other white man inspired a war cry among slaves. The song John Brown's Body wasn't just sung by white Union soldiers. It was sung by escaped slaves joining the Union Army, freedmen in Southern resistance networks, black regiments marching toward Richmond. Verse 3 reads, "He captured Harpers Ferry with 19 men so true, and he taught the slaves to fight and die, like soldiers do." What black America saw, that white America missed. To many white Americans, Brown was too radical, too violent, too fast. To many black Americans, Brown was the first white man who truly saw them, the first white man who died for them, the first white man who never asked him to wait. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where some men cross color lines. Not with words, but with wounds. John Brown was never enslaved, but he carried slavery like it was carved into his skin. And in our next chapter, part 4.3, the North wasn't ready, but he was. We'll see why even those who agreed with him feared him the most. Part 4.3, the North wasn't ready, but he was. He didn't divide the country by ideology. He divided it by courage. John Brown hated slavery, so did much of the North. But the difference, they hated it quietly. He declared war. The North opposed slavery until blood got involved. In 1859, many Northerners attended abolitionist sermons, donated to anti-slavery newspapers, supported gradual emancipation. But when John Brown struck at Harpers Ferry, they panicked. "We support the cause," they said, "but not the method." Brown replied, "Then you do not support it at all." The abolitionists WHO loved him until he acted. Brown was funded by the Secret Six, elite Northern abolitionists: Franklin Sanborn, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, George Stearns, Samuel Gridley Howe, Gerrit Smith, Theodore Parker. They praised his passion, admired his courage, but when he stormed a federal arsenal, they burned letters, fled to Canada, denied him. He didn't embarrass them with failure. He embarrassed them with conviction. Because Brown didn't hesitate, he didn't compromise, he didn't wait. Most men hated slavery, one historian wrote, but loved their own peace more. Brown shattered that peace and exposed their hypocrisy. Ralph Waldo Emerson called him a nuisance, but only after he died. Before the hanging, Emerson was cautious. Afterward, John Brown will make the gallows as glorious as the cross. Many Northern thinkers followed suit once the blood had dried. In life, he was dangerous. In death, he was useful. Douglass, he did what we only talked about. Frederick Douglass admired Brown deeply, but feared his tactics. "I could live for the cause," Douglass said. He was willing to die for it. Years later, Douglass confessed, "I trembled at his fire, because it burned where I still shivered." Even Lincoln drew the line. Abraham Lincoln opposed slavery, but he called Harpers Ferry the worst thing that could happen to the anti-slavery cause. Why? It gave the South a villain. It made moderate Northerners nervous. It forced the question, would you fight for freedom or just vote for it? Lincoln later changed, but in 1859, he feared Brown's mirror. Brown wasn't too radical for the North. He was too honest. He exposed that most Northerners could speak against slavery, could debate against slavery, but couldn't bleed against it. And so, they turned from him. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right too soon. In his letters, not one line of self-pity. While jailed, Brown wrote to dozens of Northern sympathizers. None say, "Help me escape. I was misunderstood. They lied about me." Instead, he wrote, "I am glad to suffer, because comfort is the friend of evil." To a Boston schoolteacher, teach your students that silence is never neutral. Brown forced the North to choose, and most blinked. His raid asked one question: if slavery is a sin, how long will you tolerate it? Most replied, eventually. Brown said, too late. The most dangerous thing about him: he didn't need to win. He didn't beg for compromise, didn't bargain for politics. He offered a binary: freedom or judgment. Most people want heroes they can agree with. Brown offered a mirror they had to answer. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where the loudest man in the room is sometimes the one bleeding in silence. John Brown didn't divide North and South. He divided those who whispered freedom from those willing to scream it. And in our next chapter, Part 4.4, the song that marched into war, we'll follow the tune born from his grave and into the battlefields of a nation tearing itself apart. Part 4.4, the song that marched into war. His voice was silenced, but his song got louder. December 1859, Charlestown, Virginia. John Brown is dead. His body lies buried beneath the frozen ground of North Elba, New York. But above the earth, a sound begins, soft, strange, unshakable. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. The most famous war song in American history came from a dead man's silence. Within weeks of Brown's hanging, a marching tune begins spreading among Union troops. It's not composed by generals, not commissioned by the state. It rises from soldiers, from barracks, from black regiments, from children in schoolyards. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Origins: a barracks joke turned into a battle cry. The song likely began as a parody. Soldiers of the 2nd Infantry in Boston had a comrade named John Brown, unrelated to the abolitionist. To tease him, they sang his name to an old hymn tune. The irony hit hard when the real Brown was executed, but then the lyrics changed. The joke faded, the refrain became real. He captured Harpers Ferry with his 19 men so true. He taught the slaves to fight and die, as soldiers do. The North found its first emotional language for war. Until then, the North lacked a rallying cry, a martyr, a melody to carry conviction. Brown, in death, provided all three. Even Union generals, uneasy about Brown's raid, embraced the song, because it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about purpose, sacrifice, moral war. Black America turned a lament into a weapon. Former slaves sang it while marching in blue uniforms. At Port Royal, South Carolina, one freedman reportedly said, "When we sang his name, we didn't feel like runaway slaves. We felt like soldiers." They added verses: "He died for those in bondage. Let the traitor feel the flame." The song becomes the foundation for Battle Hymn of the Republic. In 1861, Hurt Julia Ward Howe hears the soldiers singing John Brown's body outside her hotel. She's moved, haunted, inspired. That night, she writes, "Mine eyes has seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." It becomes the official hymn of the Union, a sacred song, a direct descendant of Brown's melody. But notice, his name was erased. His soul remained. Southerners heard the song and panicked. In southern cities, reports of Union soldiers chanting Brown's name fueled rumors of slave revolts, justified harsher slave codes, turned Brown into a ghost the South couldn't kill. One Confederate general said, "We fight not just against armies, but against the soul of a man long buried." Brown's family heard it and wept. Brown's surviving children heard the song sung by Union troops. His widow, Mary, wrote, "I feared his grave would be forgotten. Now it marches." His daughter, Anne, told her grandchildren, "We lost him to a rope, but found him in every song that made the North stand up straighter." The most haunting line, his soul goes marching on. It isn't a metaphor. Brown's soul literally marched into Kansas as abolitionists joined militias, into Virginia as black Union regiments liberated plantations, into Washington, D.C. as Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation. Every step forward echoed with a chorus, "Glory, glory, hallelujah." The irony, a man too extreme to follow, became the anthem for the Union's conscience. He wasn't elected, he wasn't appointed, he wasn't even supported while alive. But in death, he became the moral GPS of the war. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where the dead don't whisper. They sing. John Brown was buried in the snow, but from the cold grave came fire. A fire that lit the voices of armies and pulled a broken country toward its reckoning. Coming next, part 4.5, the man who changed Lincoln. Because even the most cautious president couldn't ignore the ghost of Harpers Ferry forever. Part 4.5, the man who changed Lincoln. He didn't write the Emancipation Proclamation, but he sharpened the pen. Abraham Lincoln never met John Brown, never shook his hand, never visited his grave. But months after Brown's hanging, he whispered, "Old John Brown may have been right." What does a cautious lawyer and the radical executionee have in common? In 1859, Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer, a moderate Republican, anti-slavery, but anti-violence, skeptical of abolitionists. He believed slavery was wrong, but believed in constitutional solutions. John Brown wanted to burn the Constitution, called slavery a sin that laws cannot excuse, invokes divine law as higher than federal law. They were opposites, but history had other plans. The debates. Lincoln walks the tightrope. During his Senate debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858, Lincoln said, "I do not believe in the social and political equality of the black and white races." He clarified, "But slavery is a moral evil. It must not spread." He walked a line carefully. Too radical, he'd lose moderate voters. Too soft, he'd lose moral force. John Brown had no such burden. The moment everything shifted, Harpers Ferry. When Brown raided Harpers Ferry, Lincoln immediately condemned it. That man's death was necessary to preserve the Union, he told reporters, but something gnawed at him. Brown had died for the same cause Lincoln claimed to support. Brown had acted while Lincoln delayed. And then came the letters. Lincoln read John Brown's final letters and didn't sleep for 3 nights. In late 1859, after Brown's execution, Republican activists in Illinois passed Brown's final writings to Lincoln. One quote stuck, "I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away." But with blood, Lincoln reread it again and again. He told a friend, "That man is more dangerous dead than alive." But he didn't mean it with contempt. He meant it with fear and the touch of awe. The election of 1860, Brown's ghost in the room. Lincoln wins the presidency in 1860, but from the moment he steps into office, Southern papers declare he is the heir of John Brown. Make no mistake, this is Brown's revolution in a new suit. Lincoln denies it, but his speeches start to shift. No longer just legal, now moral. He begins to quote scripture, to invoke justice, not just law. The Emancipation Proclamation, a political weapon, sharpened by a dead radical. January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. He claims it is a military measure, a political necessity, but he also says, "In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free." That is not the Lincoln of 1858. That is a man who has been haunted by Brown's gallows. Lincoln called Brown a mistake, but stood on the ground he bled on. In private, Lincoln still said Brown was misguided, but in 1864, he visited Harpers Ferry. He stood at the site of the raid. He said nothing. One Union soldier noted, he just looked and looked, then whispered, "Some things cannot be spoken." Brown took the first step. Lincoln walked the nation through it. Brown died in December 1859. By April 1865, Lincoln was assassinated, 5 years apart, 2 deaths, same war, different men, but one cause. Final irony, the man WHO never voted for president. Changed the mind of one. Brown believed politics were too slow, that laws were bought, that justice waited too long. Lincoln believed in patience, but history chose a different pace. And somewhere between Harpers Ferry and Gettysburg, Lincoln's heart caught fire, a fire lit by Brown. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where enemies don't just clash, they pass the torch. John Brown swung the blade, Abraham Lincoln wrote the decree, and between them, the chains of a nation began to fall. Coming next, Part 4.6 Terrorist or Freedom Fighter. We return to the one question this video set out to answer. And in that answer, lies the future of how we define justice. Part 4.6 Terrorist or Freedom Fighter. He raised a sword, but maybe what he truly split was the mirror. October 1859, he took a federal arsenal, killed men, waged war on the US government. What do we call that? If he'd been on the other side, would we still call him a terrorist? If John Brown had died defending a slave plantation, would we call him a man of principle? If he'd murdered to preserve the Union, not challenge it, would we call him a patriot? The truth is, we often define morality by who wins. But what if the one who lost was right? The case for terrorist, from the Southern perspective, and even some Northern critics, the facts were clear. He used violence to advance an ideological goal. He attacked civilians. He rejected the rule of law. He inspired fear. He aimed to spark a nationwide insurrection. These are the textbook definitions of terrorism. And yet, most terrorists don't die to free people they could never profit from. Most terrorists don't write, "I am not here for revenge. I am here to break the chains." The case for freedom fighter. Let's look at others we call heroes. George Washington led an armed rebellion. Toussaint Louverture rose in Haiti, killing slave owners. Nelson Mandela, once labeled a terrorist. Gandhi broke British law, but not with bullets. Brown didn't wait for legislation. He didn't lobby. He swung the axe. But his goal, not conquest, liberation. John Brown never killed for himself. No land, no revenge, no profit. He was a white man in his late 50s, from a free state with nothing to gain. And yet, he said, "I will die, so that others may live free." Terrorists plant bombs to be heard. Brown stood unarmed before his noose and asked to be judged by God. Even the people WHO feared him. Couldn't forget him. Lincoln, Douglas, Harriet Tubman, churches, generals, soldiers. They all disagreed on his methods, but they remembered his name. More than a century later, Martin Luther King Jr. would say, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But someone has to bend it, even if they snap in the process." The man WHO made America uncomfortable. Before Brown, slavery was a debate. After him, it became a countdown. Southern states armed their militias. Northern moderates hardened their stance. The election of Lincoln became inevitable. The war became unavoidable. Brown didn't win, but he made sure no one else could ignore the war already coming. Maybe the question isn't, was he right? Maybe it's, what would you have done? Would you have written petitions, donated money, voted, or would you, as a white man in 1859, pick up a sword and die for someone else's freedom? Because that's what he did. He never asked to be a hero. In his final days, Brown wrote, "I do not pretend to be wise. I do not claim moral purity. I only say this, I saw evil. I could not ignore it. So I thought, maybe that's not sainthood. Maybe it's not insanity either. Maybe it's just clarity." The most uncomfortable truth, if slavery is the original sin of America, then Brown was its first exorcist. And like all exorcists, he was called insane until the house stopped shaking. You've just heard MetaFacts Legends, where heroes are complicated and history bleeds in more than one color. John Brown died at the end of a rope, but left a nation dangling between its sins and its conscience. So now, you decide, who was John Brown, a terrorist with a sword and delusion, or a prophet who forced America to confront its original sin? Today, historians still argue, but one thing is clear. Before the Civil War, he struck the first blow. After the Civil War, he won it. W.E.B. Du Bois. So what do you think? Was John Brown a prophet ahead of his time, or a dangerous fanatic who lit the fuse? Tell us in the comments. Comment hero if you believe he saw the truth and dared to act. Comment terrorist if you think his violence crossed the line. Or drop unsure if you're still grappling with it. Either way, his death didn't end the debate. It started one that still echoes today. One more stories that challenge how we see history. Subscribe now, because in the next episode, we're digging into another moment that split the world in half. One decision, one man, a turning point no one saw coming.